Check, check, check. Okay. That's on. Check, check. And we just need audio coming in. So I'll go that way really quick.
How are you? Good to see you.
Check, check. This is the time to increase volume or not.
We can hear you loud and clear.
Disappointed with the draw here.
Printed all those. We printed 100
We printed 100.
slides.
Oh, you're going that way. And it is slightly directional, so you should, not easily, so you should hold it angled to your, and it's permanently on.
Okay. And you'll be using this?
Yeah.
Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to City Hall, and appreciate everybody taking time out on a beautiful early spring evening to come and have this community meeting. Tonight we have the transitional zones on the agenda. It's the only thing on the agenda. And what we'll share with the crowd, what we will do is first present information, and those are in the slides that are at the door that as you walked in. So if you did not get a copy of the slides, feel free to go back to the table to pick those up. We'll have slides up on the wall as well, but I think it's helpful for people to be able to see the information up front. Again, my name is Wyatt Shields. I'm the city manager, and I'm joined tonight by our Director of Planning, Mr. Paul Stoddard, and our lead planner for this zoning text amendment, Mr. Jack Trainer. And I want to thank both of you all for all of your dedicated work to this effort and for many other things that you do for the city. So we look forward to tonight's discussion. We do have information that we will present to you just to sort of level set. There might be people in the room who have not participated in this discussion up to this point. So we want to bring everybody along with the information that we have. What we'll share with you is the Planning Commission's review of the zoning text amendment to update our transitional zoning and walk through the differences between what the Planning Commission is recommending to the City Council versus the City Council's initial referral on this back in May a year ago. The City Council is now considering it's back in the City Council's docket, and the City Council is tentatively scheduling a first reading on revised language for a work session discussion on April 24th. So that would be the next step in the process. And Paul will go through those dates with the slides so that everyone can follow along on the process. Before we get started, we are joined by a number of members of our City Council. Since this is now on the City Council's docket, I know Council is here to listen to what the comments are, also to the staff presentation. Let me invite Mayor Tarter if you'd like to make any welcoming comments as well.
All right, thank you, Wyatt. I'm Dave Tarter. I'm the mayor of the City Falls Church. I want to welcome you all and thank you for coming out. I'd also like to acknowledge some of my colleagues who are here in the audience. Letty Hardy, Vice Mayor Letty Hardy is here. Phil Duncan, Debbie Hiscott, and I understand Mary Beth Conley is sick, and there's Caroline Leon, and Dave Snyder, I believe, is on travel. But we're all very interested in what you have to say, your thoughts, and making sure, first and foremost, you're informed of what we're considering. And secondly, have an opportunity to let us know what your thoughts are. That can be tonight as we listen to comments that are made. That can also be by contacting us separately, by email, phone call, or asking to meet with us. We know this is of great importance and great concern to many of you. You know, some of you might live right next door to some of these properties. So we get it. We understand how important this is to our community, and that's why we're having this town hall tonight. My hope is we'll have another town hall as we proceed with this to give ample opportunity for folks to understand what's going on. We did have a work session maybe 2 weeks or so ago. Some of you may have actually been here, where council members asked questions, made comments, and so that's being considered right now. You may hear some of those responses tonight. I'm not sure exactly, but certainly in our next work session, which Wyatt just mentioned, April 27th, I believe, 24th or 27th? 24th. But so, and beyond that, possibility of a first reading, another first reading, a new first reading at the end of May or thereabouts. But Paul is going to go through a full schedule with you all. But in the meantime, once again, thank you for coming out, and we very much value your thoughts and your questions and concerns. Wyatt?
Thank you, Mayor Tarter. So, Mr. Stoddard, I'll turn the mic over to you. And again, thank you for all of your work on this with the Planning Commission and with community and now with the City Council.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Shields. As Wyatt said, I'll repeat it here. Thank you, everyone. I know this has been a long effort to get to this point, and this is another evening that you've volunteered and offered to contribute to this. So thank you for coming out and making your voices heard as part of the important process. We are using mics tonight, even though it's a relatively small room. We're also piping this through the city's live stream, so it's available on Teams, it's available on the cable channels, and so we will be using the mics throughout the night, both for ourselves as well as anybody who wants to ask questions or provide comments. The slides that you've got, we have those in hard copy for those folks who are watching remote. There's a web address up on this title screen, the fallschurchva.gov, TZone updates. We don't have the slides up there right now, but we will have them up later this week, either tomorrow or the day after. But with that, let me jump into the presentation. So what I want to do is start the conversation by talking about why T-zones. Why is the community getting into this conversation about updating its zoning ordinance? The most important thing motivating this conversation is about thinking about the need for housing needs. And it's not just the needs of the folks who are here today, and it's not just the folks who are going to be here tomorrow. It's finding a solution that works for both the current as well as the future generations to meet those housing demands. It's also about promoting diversity. We've got some later slides where you'll see that housing stock in the city has largely segmented into two types of housing that are available, either generally larger format single-family houses or smaller format multifamily housing. And so looking for some way to expand that slice that's in between those two. Third is looking for a way to encourage reinvestment in the T-zones. So folks have probably seen the cranes going up that are for construction of newer buildings within the B zones, the special exception projects. You've probably also seen the land clearing activity and the new houses coming up as the 1950s ramblers come down and the larger single family houses go up. Where there hasn't been a lot of reinvestment is in those T-zones, and it's in large part due to the rules that are in place today make it difficult to redevelop and reinvest. But of course, as delivering on all those goals, it is important to think about what the T-zones are supposed to do in terms of providing a design transition as well as a use transition between those B zones, Washington, Broad Street, and the residential zones on the other side. So why is it important for planning for housing needs? Right, a lot of this has to do with what is the demand for housing. Right, houses don't create people. Housing is a place for people to live. There is the continuing expectation of regional population growth between 2025, 2045. That first line, expected regional population growth of about 20%, and those are post-pandemic projections for the region. And when I say region, you can see that tan-colored map on the right. That's the larger metropolitan Washington area that's served by the Council of Governments, which is a regional consortium, and they provide these demographic projections for us. City population also expected to grow by about 30%. That is a little bit higher than the regional average, and that is a function of the fact that the city is an activity center. So it's one of those places in the region where people can meet their everyday needs. There's shopping, there's dining, there's schools, there's libraries, there's housing. So people can do everything they can in a day-to-day world in these activity centers, and it is part of the regional strategy for sustainable growth. So try to preserve that outer farmland, try not to pave over new areas of the region, and instead build where there's already infrastructure and services. And then also city households expected to grow by 40%. And that's an even higher percentage, and that has to do with a shift in household demographics. That the average household size in the city as well as in the region is getting smaller. So if you have population growth and those households are getting smaller, that means you need more housing to support all those families. Housing for economic development. Of course, housing people is one angle to the importance of housing. There's also a reason to have housing locally, and that's economic development. People who are working in jobs in the city need a place to live, whether you're a teacher or you work at a restaurant or you're a firefighter, right? All the jobs that you think of, the folks in your neighborhood, just like Sesame Street said, they need a place to live. And it's also about local spending. If you want to have unique shops, if you want to have unique restaurants, if you want to have unique vendors, then they need dollars to survive. And having people within a close distance is the best way to support those local businesses. And then also housing for sustainability. I mentioned this already, but it is part of the regional strategy, and the city is a signatory onto this idea of focusing development in places where you already have infrastructure and services. Planning for inclusive communities. So this idea of planning for housing supply isn't new to the city's policy discussions. I've got a couple quotes up here on the slide. First comes from, and I'm sorry, all these quotes are going to come out of the comprehensive plan. For folks who aren't familiar, comprehensive plan is a policy document that just about every jurisdiction in the country has, and it charts out a path for about 20 plus years of development, what's needed in terms of city supports, infrastructure, environmental needs, so on and so forth. It tries to knit all those things together into a cohesive picture. The first quote is a snippet from the city's vision statement, which I'll go ahead and read out. By investing in neighborhoods, community services and facilities, schools and parks, the city preserves a small town character and history while honoring a deep commitment to progress in a growing community. More recently, the city updated the housing component of the comprehensive plan. And I'll read out these two quotes. First, to create and maintain a diverse supply of housing that supports an inclusive and welcoming community. And then a particular strategy to support that goal, revise development regulations to allow a wider variety of housing types. On the right is a bar chart. This is the point that I made earlier about the small supply of housing that's not single family and not multifamily. The red bars along the bottom going back to 2002 up to 2019, that's the stock of single family detached housing staying relatively stable. And then the gray bar on the top is multifamily housing, the larger developments that have been going up around town. That bar steadily increasing. And then that blue bar in the middle is the supply of everything in between, whether that's townhouses, duplexes, quadplexes, staying absolutely flat. All right, next slide. All right, so I'm actually going to turn over my presentation here to Jack. Jack Trainer's been our lead planner on this, going on a year now, and I want to thank him for all his effort and his research into this. I talked about why it's important to think about the T-zones. Jack's going to walk through what is the process for a zoning text amendment. He's going to talk about the components that are proposed within the various changes. And then after that, we'll turn it over to you all for questions, comments, and discussions. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Mr. Stoddard. For the rest of the agenda, in a second here, I'll talk about what the components are that we're talking about in the T-zones, and then we'll go to Q&A after that. But first, forgot to mention the zoning text amendment process. The zoning ordinance in the city allows for changes to the zoning districts over time. As you can see in that left box, there's the three steps there. The first is a council referral, also called a first reading. That referral then goes to the Planning Commission for deliberation and recommendation back to City Council, which is where we are now, which is step 3, which is kind of a two-pronged step, actually. Council can either accept the recommendations and issue a second reading, or council can go back to step 1. So right now we're getting ready to go back to step 1 after a new first reading. So that's kind of played out on the schedule. To the right here, we're having the community town hall right in the middle there. Above that are some of the action meetings that have happened in the past, going all the way back to February 2021. Council will next have a work session on April 24th, right here in town, City Hall. From there, a new first reading will happen, anticipating spring 2023 for that, where it'll then go back to the Planning Commission. And at the Planning Commission will have at least one work session, probably a couple more, before making its recommendation back to City Council in this summer. And then it's anticipated that a new second reading will happen in the summer of 2023 to wrap up the process. Okay. So now we'll get into what we'll kind of break down what the considerations are in the T-zones that we're talking about changing here. We've kind of broken these down. There's 13 total smaller components that we've grouped into 4 The first is uses, where we talk about residential and commercial and what the kind of proposed differences are in the T-zone district areas. Next, we'll talk about urban design considerations, including how the building envelope can be formed. This is setbacks and building height and lot coverage. And then we'll move on to the environment, where we'll talk about stormwater, historic preservation, parking, and affordable housing. And lastly, we'll wrap up with the review process about how an application is reviewed either by right or with special conditional consideration. All right, so first, residential uses. Today, 1 and 2 family are allowed by right in the T-zones. 3 and 4 families are not. Moving on to the council referral, I'll keep going with the 1 to 4 family, first 2 rows there. Council's referral didn't include any expansion to the, City Council's referral included removing 1 and 2 family uses in the T-zones and had no mention of 3 and 4 family uses. In the Planning Commission's recommendation, this kept removing 1 and 2 family uses as allowable uses, so no new 1 or 2 family homes could be built, but 3 and 4 families could be built by right. And in the staff's most recent recommendation, and the staff's recommendation is a new column we've added since the last meeting on this, and this is subject to be updated up until the council work session on the 24th. But right now, staff's recommendation is the same as the Planning Commission's, which is no new 1 or 2 family units in the T-zones, and keeping the Planning Commission's recommendation about adding 3 and 4 family homes being able to be built by right. For townhouses and multifamily condo and apartment buildings, townhouses today are allowed by right in the T-zones, but you need 3 acres in order to build them, which makes this essentially impossible to do in the T-zones. Condos and apartment buildings are not allowed. In the council's referral, townhouses and multifamily buildings would be allowed on sites of up to 1 acre, but only through the special use permit. So that's a conditional, we'll get into more what the special use permit is in a bit, but essentially it's a conditional allowance, and so you wouldn't be able to do that by right. There's additional review for that. Planning Commission held the same as the council's referral, and the staff's recommendation is the same there. So we can go next to commercial uses. Today, there's on that far left column, there's several different allowable uses in the T-zones today. I'm going to go right to the council's referral, which had removing boarding houses and adding certain things like clinics for human care, restaurants, and neighborhood serving retail uses. In the Planning Commission's recommendation, it was largely the same as council's, except the Planning Commission added parking lots as on the chopping block being removed as an allowable principal use in T-zones. And the staff recommendation is largely the same. Staff has removing boarding houses and parking lots as allowable principal uses in the T-zones, adding clinics for human care, restaurants, and neighborhood focusing retail sales and service uses. Okay, mixed use. Today, mixed use is allowable through the MUR district. The MUR has only been used once in the city history. There's a lot of regulations that go into the MUR. In council's referral, this included removing the MUR regulation to achieve mixed use. And in the Planning Commission's recommendation was the same, and so is staff's, is removing MUR to create some mixed use development. Mixed use through the special use permit or a conditional allowance. In the council's referral, SUP would be required if any portion of that mixed use proposal requires conditional approval. So whether it's a commercial use that requires a conditional approval or it's the residential component, anything that triggers a special use permit review makes the entire project subject to that extra review. And that's the same under the Planning Commission's recommendation and in staff's recommendation to date. Okay, districts. We have two different T-zones today, T1 and T2. This map shows where they are. You can see T1 is the predominant T district. There's only a handful of T2 districts, including the Kaiser Permanente garage building and another, I believe, office building and parking lot on Park Avenue there. The only difference in T1 and T2 today is that T1 allows 1 and 2 family homes, whereas the T2 district does not. In the City Council's referral, this included combining the two districts, in light of the minuscule differences between the two and combining them to a single T1 district. In the Planning Commission's recommendation, this also included combining the two districts, but also added certain geographic stipulations, such as on Park Avenue, all commercial uses would be subject to the special use permit or a conditional review. So no conditional uses could be built by right on Park Avenue and on North Washington Street, north of Great Falls, in order to encourage some mixed use or more kind of commercial development. No new residential would be allowed on in the T-zones on North Washington Street on Great Falls, north of Great Falls. Staff's recommendation is largely the same. A notable difference is staff's recommending that some commercial development be allowed by right on Park Avenue up to 4,000 square feet. And that's the only difference, yes. So moving on to building height. On the left, this diagram shows what's allowed today by right. That's a commercial building today can be built 45 feet tall without any step backs. The proposed height that came out of the council's referral allows up to 50 feet with a 10-foot step back. So that means that there's 10 feet behind the building face that fronts any residential district. That building would be allowed to achieve a 40% height maximum before having to go 10 feet back in the lot and then up the last 10 to get that 50 feet. Today, let's see, and for T-zones for 1 to 4 families, the building height that's allowed is up to 35 feet or 2.5 stories. The council recommendation didn't expound upon that language, and the PC recommendation was the same, allowing 3 and 4 family homes to be built by right up to 35 feet, and the staff recommendation is the same. For townhouses and I'll do townhouses first. For townhouses, today that's achievable up to 35 feet, and for all other uses in T1 or T2 today, again, that's a commercial building can reach up to 45 feet. In the council's recommendation, a building could be built up to 50 feet or 4 stories, whichever is the shortest, with that 10-foot step back stipulation. In the Planning Commission's recommendation, a building could be built by right to the maximum of 40 feet, and the 50 feet would be a conditional allowance with the 10-foot step back, and the staff recommendation is the same. So setbacks now, not step backs, but setbacks, talks about where the building can be placed on the lot, how big the front yard has to be, the backyard, the side yard. So today, the front setback varies based on use and location. So it's 15 to 20 feet. In the council's referral, it also varies 15 to 20 feet, again, based on use and location, whether it's on, there's different, if it's a T-zone property on Washington, I believe, then the front setback is mandated at 20 feet, but not on Park Avenue, for instance. Under the Planning Commission proposal, the front setback by right would be 20 feet with a conditional allowance of a reduction of 5 feet to achieve a 15-foot front setback, and staff proposal is the same. For the rear setback, this varies from 0 feet to 40 feet, again, depending on the use in the abutting district. In the council's referral, the rear setback would be 10 feet. In the planning commission's proposal, it would be 20 feet by right with a conditional rear setback of 10 feet, and staff is the same. And for side setbacks, this varies right now from 10 to 20 feet. The council's referral included a 10-foot side setback. Planning commission and staff hold the same currently. So for lot coverages, when we're talking about lot coverages, there's 3 different kinds of lot coverages that are considered. One is tree canopy coverage, another is impervious surface coverage, and another is building coverage. So impervious surface talks about not only the percentage of the lot that a building covers, but all impervious material that covers the lot. So driveways, patios, anything that causes stormwater runoff. And so I'll just run through what the regulations are right now. Currently, today, there's no language on a tree canopy minimum in T-zones, nor was there any language in the City Council's referral. And the Planning Commission's recommendation, that included a 15% tree canopy minimum. And the staff recommendation includes the same. For impervious surface maximums, there's no maximum set on T-zones today. That's why it's showing 100%. Same with the City Council's initial referral. And the Planning Commission's recommendation, that included an 80% cap on impervious surface materials on T-zone lots. And staff recommends including that. For building coverage, or the amount of the space that the lot is taken up by the building's footprint. Today it's 40% cap on T-zones. City Council bumped that up to 80% in its referral. And in the Planning Commission's recommendation, they included a 60% building coverage maximum by right, and through the special use permit procedure, a development could achieve a 70% building coverage maximum, and staff has the same. So we have a couple examples of some of the developments we're talking about, or potential development on Park Avenue. We have 2 examples that have been built, and then we have a couple examples of what didn't get built but was proposed once in the city. The first is the Great Forest Townhomes. This is located at Park and Pennsylvania Avenue. This has an acreage of just over 2 acres. The front setback facing facing Penn and Park are both 25 feet. The side setback to the north is about 30 feet, and on the east, that setback is currently at about 57 feet. The building coverage is 26%, with impervious surface coverage of 43%, and this was built in 1989. The next one is Madison Homes. This is also on Park Avenue, just down the street from the library. This has an acreage of just over 1 acre with about 50% building coverage and 68% impervious surface coverage. It was built in 2001. Its setbacks are a little different. On Park, it's about 17 feet back from Park, and about 8 feet from the southernmost lot line there. To the west, it's 31 feet from the lot line, and in the east, it's got a 20-foot setback there. So this is an example of a property that didn't get built. This is at the corner of Park and Pennsylvania, I believe, and Lee, excuse me. This proposal was 0.69 acres. Included about 87% building coverage and impervious coverage, was proposed in 2018, and its setbacks are above it. 16 feet from Park Avenue, 16 feet from Lee, just over 3 feet from the east and 10 feet from its southernmost lot line. And there's a kind of watercolor rendering of that proposal down there. So we've talked a little bit about what some of the urban design considerations are in the T-zones. This is a rendering of the potential bulk of a building that came out of the Planning Commission proposal. That's what's the kind of transparent box there, and the two buildings underneath are about to scale of what is there currently. So this is the entire site here are combined lots for about 30,000 square feet. So as proposed, or under the current Planning Commission proposal, this bulk of a building could take up 60% of the lot by right. It's about 18,000 square feet. It could achieve 40 feet in height and a 20-foot front setback from both Park and Lee because it's a corner lot, so that it's got technically 2 front yards. And then in the back, there's a 10-foot rear setback, but that, because the building is oriented facing Park, and it takes up 60% lot coverage. Obviously, that's greater than 10 feet, but that's the rest of the lot that's left over after the building's achieved that 60% lot coverage. So next, we'll talk about stormwater. Like I said, there's no T-zone specific stipulations on stormwater. Right now, any development built in the T-zones would comply with the city stormwater quality and quantity regulations, namely that after redevelopment, the water can't be worse and it can't produce more runoff than it did pre-redevelopment. Excuse me. For historic preservation today, we have the Historic and Cultural Conservation District. This isn't T-zone specific, but it speaks to historic protections that are citywide. The City Council referral includes maintaining the HCC, and the Planning Commission recommendation also holds maintaining the HCC, but also added a special use permit consideration that any proposed redevelopment, including a designated property, include consideration for incorporating that structure into the redevelopment. And staff includes the same staff recommendation. So for parking, today, multifamily and townhouse use per the zoning code require 1 to 2.5 off-street parking spaces per unit. For single-family homes, it's 1 space per unit, and commercial off-street parking requirements vary by use and size. There were no parking-specific regulations included in that City Council referral. The Planning Commission included in its recommendation 1 off-street parking space per home. Per unit, and the staff recommendation also includes that 1 space per home, but also recommends 1 EV-ready space per home or 1 DC fast charger per 5 homes. And what that means is that an EV-ready space basically means an EV-ready space is what most folks that do have an electric car use to charge their car at home. It's a plug-in socket, so it's all the infrastructure to plug in your electric car at home through like I think it's a 120-volt plug-in, kind of what a typical appliance is used for. And that's what most residential uses are. The DC fast charger, I believe, is it's the highest category of charge in terms of the time it takes to achieve a full charge. We've seen this in other zoning codes across the country where some municipalities have the option for a developer to include 1 DC fast charger to substitute an EV-ready space, or for up to 5. And I think in 1 EV-ready space takes about 8 hours to achieve a full charge, whereas the DC takes more like 1 hour or less. I think we can keep going. Okay, affordable housing. Today, there's no affordable housing requirements in the T-zone districts. City Council included in its referral a regulation of 10% of all new homes that are built in T-zones include affordable or workforce housing. Excuse me. In the Planning Commission's recommendation, this included a T-zone overlay tax district that would capture the incremental change of property values from new development in T-zones, and that that change in property value would be reinvested in a citywide affordable housing fund. Staff's recommendation is mirrors the same as the City Council's, that 10% of all new homes developed in T-zones be either affordable or workforce housing. This also includes a cash in lieu option where a developer would pay cash in lieu of building the affordable units for financing of these units to be built elsewhere in the city. And staff is also looking into unit size options to offer as options in T-zone redevelopment. All right, application review. So there are 3 different kinds of application reviews we want to touch on here. The first 2, special exception and special use permits, are for conditional uses. So everything that is not allowable by right goes through either the special exception or the special use permit process. And it takes, for special exceptions, this can take 11 to 24 months. For the SUP or special use permit, this is 8 to 12. Typically for smaller, a la T-zone developments. And for site plans, these are for by right projects, but the site plan process follows any conditional process. So whether it goes through the special exception or the special use permit, after it completes that 11 to 24 or 8 to 12 months, it would then go into the site plan process, which is an additional 3 to 6 months. And the board and commission review procedures for all 3. For special exception, this includes all boards and commissions because these are for larger conditional projects. For the SUP, these are select boards and commissions like the Planning Commission. And for site plan, this includes the Urban Forestry Commission and the Architectural Advisory Board, AAB. Public review for all 3 of these, there's public review and public meetings built into all 3 of these procedures. Under the special exception, there's the project website up on the city page that details information about the special exception project. There's public hearings, and there's also a walking tour of the site. For special use permit projects, there's also the project website and public hearings, but not necessarily the walking tour. And for site plans, this includes the project website and public hearings as well. Final consideration for all these. Council has final consideration for all special exception projects and would for all special permit projects. And we'll get to what those considerations are in a second. For Planning Commission has final consideration for all site plans. So the SUP considerations, this is the criteria that council would weigh all SUP projects that come before them. And these are consistency with the comprehensive plan and small area plans, whether the project enlarges the city tax base, whether it includes affordable housing, what is the environmental component of it, whether it fosters, environmental goals that the city wants to see, and also achieves a harmonious design transition, specifically for T-zones, obviously. So, okay, and so I know I just ran through all 13 of these components. Again, we broke these down into uses and urban design, environmental, and then the review process. And so lastly, Paul touched on this earlier, but why are we talking about T-zones? The first is meeting the housing needs of the city as part of a larger growing demand for housing in the region. Second is to promote diversity, inform and price for residential and commercial spaces. And and encouraging reinvestment in the T-zones, which hasn't experienced that reinvestment that perhaps other places in the city have. And lastly, to provide a transition in building height intensity of use from our lower intensity residential neighborhoods to our higher intensity business district areas. And last slide for me, the process. So as a reminder, we're having this town hall today in March 2023. Council will take this up again at its work session on April 24th. And then from there, a new first reading will occur in spring, which is when the Planning Commission will take it back up again. It'll have work sessions before it makes its a new recommendation back to City Council, at which time Council will have more public meetings, work sessions before a new and anticipated second reading happens this summer. So all this information and the schedule can be found on the T-Zone page on the city's website. Again, that's the link that's on the title slide. These slides will be up tomorrow. And so I encourage everyone to follow that page for the most up-to-date information. So thank you.
Thank you, Jack. All right, so we have heard some comments in response to sort of meetings we've hosted in the past, as well as the league session, and again, appreciation to the League of Women Veterans for hosting us that night, about a desire for something of a more structured conversation versus letting the comments necessarily range from topic to topic. So what I might suggest for the group is that we take these sort of topics in order, starting with any questions related to uses, maybe spend about 20 minutes on that, and then I can take the temperature of the room, see if people want to stay there or move on to urban design, maybe 30 minutes there, again, take the temperature of the group, and then move through environment and review process as well. I'm not seeing anyone object to that. There's a hand raised. So there was a question from the crowd. And we do have mics once we get into the questions about who is Jane Jacobs. Yes, I have read her books. I'm sorry? Well, there was Life and Death of American Cities. What did she feel? All right. So let's move to the questions sort of in the considerations here. So let's start with uses. And so if I could ask folks who want to ask questions, go ahead and line up. I think we've got this mic turned on. There we go. So if you have questions or comments, please do line up at the mic. We'll take folks in the order they line up, and happy to take them as they come.
I'm sorry, your name is?
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Paul Stoddard, Planning Director
I'm
of the city.
Peter Markham. Jane Jacobs, in her book, Life and Death of American Cities, what was one of the most important things that she focused on?
Sure. So one of the biggest things, at least one of my takeaways from it, was the idea of a need for continual rejuvenation of areas. So not mega developments, not tearing down everything that was old, but seeing a regular cycle of improvements, that what is the new office space today and maybe too expensive for a mom and pop store becomes that hand down space for the next generation of mom and pop stores.
I believe the criteria that she used that was most important to her was street life. What sort of the streets, were they accessible to people, and did people feel comfortable using the streets as public thoroughfares, and was there a vibrant street life? Do you think these T-zone developments will encourage a vibrant street life?
So the question is there a promotion of vibrant street life? And I think some of that is going to come down to the uses in the building. The proposal here does actually expand on that to include sort of neighborhood retail, restaurants, those kinds of things that people would use on an everyday basis. The other thing this does is actually encourage residential development. If you go to, say, a downtown Roslyn in the evening, you can see that place is empty. That for a long time, there's been a recognition in the planning world that a mix of uses with both commercial and residential areas in the same district are important to promoting that kind of vibrancy.
From what I've seen of your development plans, I don't think there's going to be much opportunity for a vibrant street life. Your sidewalks are narrow, The buildings are built very close to them, and most of the people, it'll be a ghetto of large box-type structures that will house lots of people. But I don't think there'll be much urban street life at all. And one of the reasons that Roslyn, well, there are many reasons Roslyn looks like a bit of a ghost town, is many, many tall buildings. And these buildings that you're proposing are going to be tall enough so that people will feel like they're walking in a canyon. I walk that street, Park Avenue, fairly frequently with my wife, and there aren't that many people using the street now. And I think what you're proposing won't make it better, Paul. I understand, I can see good things for what you're proposing. I believe that people do need to live somewhere. I know where the mayor lives. It's not in a place like that. Where do you live?
I live over in now a single-family house over in Arlington.
Okay, right. Well, I'm not sure if many of the people who are planning this would want to live in those buildings. And
Yeah, so
I
one
know
of the
many
things
people,
that comes up is
many,
this
did
idea
I
of
see the hands of people who are in favor of this? Good. 1, 2, 3. Well, that's good. Could I see the hands of people who think maybe it's not such a great idea? Okay. This has been going on for quite some time, and it would seem as if the majority of people who feel they are affected are not in favor of it. And I'm not saying it's necessarily a totally bad idea. I'm just saying that your plans aren't what the majority of the people living along that street want. And I'm all for development, but I look at that thing that's at the end of sort of, what is it, West Avenue, and what's that called again, that big thing? Founders Row, yeah. That, I mean, the trees are in boxes. They're not going to live. It looks pretty sterile, and I don't see many people walking around there. I think it's good to have development, and I understand that we don't want to build over every bit of farmland. I just don't think that this is necessarily the way to go. And I'm not really pleased. I'm not a NIMBY. I live on Park Avenue. I live in a Park Towers condominium, and I understand that, yeah, we got to put people in big buildings. I think you should focus more on street life. Anyway, I'm done. Thank you.
Thanks.
So since I asked for a structured conversation, I'm just gonna deal with the issue number one on your list, residential uses. And I want to just probe, and maybe you can give us more explanation about your thinking, because it seems to me the biggest single square foot, more acreage section of the city that's in T-zones is on North Washington Street. If you look at the maps that you've distributed, we only have a couple blocks on Park Avenue. There's just a few spots here and there all around the city, but the largest section is there. And the purported reason for this initiative is to increase housing in the city and to create residential housing, and yet we seem to have excluded the biggest area. And we've had many conversations, as you know, in our own condo about what we want. And, I think we are in favor of residential housing in our area on Park Avenue. We think it's a good fit as long as it's within an appropriate scale in terms of height and proximity to our building. So we're not opposed to that conceptually, and I see the focus on Park Avenue is on residential. And I'd just like to probe as to why you've excluded such a large section of this T-zone when the purpose of the whole initiative seems to be housing.
So the question about sort of North Washington, and actually if we can go to the district slide. So here's the map of the current T-zones in the city. Oh, there you went. And the motivation here was actually based on looking back at the city's small area guidance. So looking at the guidance for the West Broad Street corridor, which includes Park Avenue, it does call for that sort of mix of uses, civic grade streets where you might see these sort of everyday uses. So whether it's, a modest scale residential or a modest scale commercial, that fits within the vision for Park Avenue, according to the small area plan. For North Washington Street, the small area plan calls for North Washington to develop as a commercial corridor. And currently there's Zone T, which requires largely commercial uses, so that fits the small area plan guidance. the sort of the thinking in the small area plan is that in order to preserve that as a commercial corridor, sort of don't allow an outlet for all residential development to butt up against North Washington, but instead leave open the option that they could, and this gets a little mechanical, but you could pursue a rezoning to a B district and access the special exception process, because then they would still have a committed commercial component. So it's a little bit of a nuance of how the zoning ordinance works, but the idea is that you want to keep commercial uses along North Washington, and there are two ways to do that. Either allow the property to stay in a T-zone without access to residential, or allow a rezoning and a special exception process with a committed commercial component. Does that answer the question?
I guess the question, the follow-on would be, there won't be a whole lot of residential housing built if that's the philosophy.
Yeah, so the follow-on then is sort of where does the residential go if you've sort of excluded some of the larger acreage parcels. And I think there are still meaningful parcels that are left. You can see a couple parcels along Hillwood, a couple along Roosevelt, of course, Park Avenue. And then also, at some point in the future, it could give a second life to some of the commercial condos along North Washington, sort of south of Great Falls. Yeah.
I'm Allison Brown. I've lived in the city of Falls Church since 2005. I do support the changes to the T-zones to make them more flexible for more uses. And in terms of the uses, so I appreciate that it expands, the uses somewhat in certain ways. Do you have any sense of what developers are thinking once they see these proposals? Is there a realistic chance that developers will come in and start some projects, given that we haven't seen development in these areas for so long, and developers need economies of scale. I mean, it's going to be very hard for them to build very small things, so they really do need economies of scale. I'm wondering if you have any feedback from developers.
Question about whether we've gotten feedback from developers, and the short answer is yes, and then there's a longer answer follows with it. So we have been talking to some developers at the very beginning of this process in 2021 to get a sense of sort of what are the bounds of the problem. Throughout the way, we have conversed with one developer that doesn't do townhouse construction on acres this small. So it was something of a neutral party, someone who's an expert in development but wouldn't be interested in a project on this scale. And then more recently, leading up to the Planning Commission's recommendation, they did receive a raft of comments from developers that do townhouses at this scale. I think these recommendations are within the range of what would be workable. We are planning a second round of outreach to them based on these recommendations and ahead of any formal action by the Planning Commission and Council. The second question, I think, about sort of whether this was workable and economies of scale, that is one of the challenges when you're working on small sites. I think one of the biggest things you can offer to a developer is certainty, so that they know how long they're going to have to be in the process, because they're holding a contract on the land, they're paying for soft costs in terms of engineers and architects and lawyers, and so letting them know how long are you going to be in this before you get a decision, I think that's important to them. And also, to the extent that you can clarify what are the rules for either accepting or rejecting a proposal. I think it's that idea of time and certainty are the most important. And of course, having a box that's buildable in the first place.
Thanks.
Hello, I'm Brian Reach. I work for Falls Church News Press. I'm also moving into the North Gate and have been staying there. I'm moving in officially right now. And it being kind of in the center of this T-zone, the balcony that I'm in overlooks the Bank of America right at the intersection of Jefferson and Maple. And that's how I get to work. And every time I drive that way, because I don't like the highway for traffic, I don't like walking on it because it doesn't feel safe, I go in a street. And I take Maple up and then I take Park. And it sounds like Park is kind of being introduced as a new main street, as something that's not on the highway. So you're not scared, and I mean, it's loud. Has there been any consideration of taking any of those streets that are back there that are kind of cluttered with car dealerships or whatnot that aren't necessary cut-through streets and cutting off traffic and making them walkable plazas more like Shirlington? Maybe perhaps just a very slow path for like a single lane of cars to go by and just expanding all that street space so that there could be kind of a refuge from the bustle. And personally, is there any consideration to put noise proofing on the windows of any building on North Washington Street? Because 3 rooms in, I can tell you when the car turned all the way up the street from the bathroom. It is incredibly loud, and this is a brand new build. So I think a part of this quality of life is maybe forcing people to have the sound barrier and to get rid of that, like, we're right on 29 and 66 in the middle of all of that.
Yeah.
That's all.
All right. Well, thank you for what you do every day. I do like reading your stuff. So there was a question about, I think one question was about sort of the design of some of the city streets, especially in various sort of commercial areas or just off commercial areas in the city. And the city does have a whole suite of small area plans. Folks have probably been following the East End small area plan, but we've got small area plans for the other corridors. And a lot of those plans do have concepts of reintroducing green spaces, focusing on this idea of walkable, bikeable streets, sort of accommodating auto traffic, but realizing sort of quality of life is the more important thing. So bringing the city streets up to streetscape standards with street trees and benches and proper lighting and sufficient crossing so people do feel comfortable using any city by any mode. The other question about sort of construction quality and soundproofing, a lot of that is regulated by state building code, which of course transfers down to the localities. And that is what we can hold people to. Sometimes you will see higher qualities of construction in different projects. Some of that is up to the discretion of the builder, but it's always something we can encourage them to do, especially when it faces some of the noisier routes in the city.
In Roslyn, you can't hear the airplanes.
Yeah.
In your apartment that faces the river, and here I can tell if somebody is talking on their cell phone 3 stories down, walking their dog,
Right.
and I know what they're talking about. I mean, it's insane.
Yeah. So just to put it back into the mic so everyone can, just to follow up, that there are places that do soundproofing better, and the specific note that they can block out sound about airplanes in Roslyn. We can certainly block out cell phone conversations in Falls Church. Thanks, you. Yeah.
Hi, yes, Alex Strong at 107 Lawton Street, right next to the Big Pit. I wanted to build on the comments about North Washington, specifically north of Great Falls, and sort of really drill down on that piece. So the question is, can you walk us through, I mean, I know you said the small area plan is sort of why, the genesis of why we are, but my concern is what has changed since then. That was what, 2014 probably?
Yeah, the first one, 2012, 2014 for North Washington. Yeah.
Right. So the average, the median home value has probably is increased. The need for additional housing has probably increased. I'm concerned about a sort of dogmatic approach to following the small area plan when we need more housing, right? I mean, I don't think a lot of people are opposed to housing broadly in this plan. It seems to make a lot of sense on these parcels. I also wanted to see if you'd talk a little bit about aggregating those. Let's say Sunrise sells out at some point. Does that convert then under this plan, under the Planning Commission changes, does that convert that would convert to commercial only, correct?
We can answer, so the answer is no. I can explain the nuances of Sunrise.
Okay. Okay, you can hold it. So that is my concern. That was already voiced. I worked for 2 decades in housing policy for the National Association of Home Builders. Our members built the Madison townhomes. The NIMBY was obviously here, and that was a good time, and everybody had a good laugh. I don't think I've ever seen a plan come forward purporting to increase housing, be cheered, and yet the potential for housing be reduced at the end of the day. That is a great concern to me, and so I think townhomes in particular, but housing more generally there on North Washington should still be in the mix. And I'm concerned, again, about the dogmatic approach to following the small area plan when our housing needs have clearly changed and accelerated in some cases. So, yeah, if you could talk a little bit about the potential down the road for aggregating those parcels. And then the one final thing, if we can drill, I don't think you have the actual parcels, do you? You only have what's in the printed materials, yes?
Right. If you're asking asking about sort of data sheets on all the individual parcels. We do have those in some of the
Yeah.
older planning packets.
Right.
And can certainly.
So I'm thinking of at Great Falls on North Washington, facing the Paris building on the left. So if, let's say 10 years down the road or whatever, that is, those parcels are aggregated, built up into commercial. In so doing, there's a pathway that comes from Madison Park back on Lawton to North Washington. So you could potentially, and then there's a lot of tree cover in there as well, you could, as well as a historic building. So in one fell swoop, you could potentially do away with a pedestrian thoroughfare, tree cover, and historic buildings. That seems pretty aggressive to me. So just throwing that out there. And I'd like to hear again more about the potential for consolidation of those parcels and what might happen there.
Sure. So let's go, I think first sort of sticking to the small area plans, or are we sort of over sticking to the small area plans? I will say that sort of it is the hope of mine that once we get to a conclusion on the East End small area plan, we'll actually cycle back and start refreshing those city small area plans, get revised guidance for these corridors. Things have changed. If we can go, in terms of sort of housing supply and housing capacity, if we can go back actually into the Y slides, that bar chart, with the sort of three colors. So those gray bars on the top, there we go, where the city grew from about 4,700 housing units to about 6,000 housing units between 2002 and 2019. That was all sort of a product of the special exception development. So typically those projects, they started out with a different mix, but more recently they're somewhere between 70 and 80% residential, so still predominantly residential, while still providing a commercial footprint along the corridor. So that special exception process has been a vehicle for housing production in the city, especially a housing gap that the city was missing. Absent that, it was very difficult for folks on sort of one or even two incomes to find a place to sort of start out in the city.
This doesn't, sorry to interrupt, but this
Yeah.
doesn't have the projections. Like we've got the area projections 10, 20 years, 30
Right.
years out, and we're still going to need substantially more housing above.
Yeah, we ran a really nice exercise. Well, I thought it was a nice exercise. So we ran an exercise with the Planning Commission at their retreat in January, and I continue those materials as well. We did an on-the-map exercise where we looked at, what are the population and household projections over the next 10 years, over the next 20 years, and how is the city going to accommodate that? And then take that advice and that input from the Planning Commission about sort of what are the right forms, what are the right locations to really think about housing in the city, for, the next generation and the generation after that, really setting the city on the path for a sustainable housing supply. The other thing, if we could go, there was a question about sort of urban design, the considerations page maybe. I'm sorry, go up one about sort of who has final approval on which projects. There we go. So in terms of allocation reviews, whether it's a special exception or SUP, final decision authority would be with the council. And council has been a big advocate for pedestrian and bicycle connections, especially to green spaces. So a lot of the recent projects that have been approved have included dedicated pedestrian throughways through the building. And I would hope that if there was a development next to a park, we would find a way to make sure that we get that connection. If you think about Founders Row, it's actually got a brand new street going right through the so especially when you get to those large acreages, that's what I would hope for. Oh, there was one more question. If we go to the commercial uses, there was a question about the sunrise, and I know this has come up as well in a couple different forums. So the sunrise, so this is all going to be zoning speak here, but the sunrise assisted living facility is classified as what's called a residential institution. So that lives in a category separate from residential uses. So even as sort of the language says, no residential uses along North Washington, that would not prohibit or restrict something like a sunrise from growing in under the T-zones. Same with group homes like the Miller House.
I guess my question was, thinking down the road, what if Sunrise, for whatever reason, sold, left? Those parcels were then consolidated.
Yep.
Would it be exclusively commercial, or could it then be residential as well? I don't think it can under the plan.
Sure. So just to put it into the mic, question is if Sunrise sort of consolidates and redevelops, could they still do a Sunrise-like product? And the answer is yes. Residential institutions could still go in regardless of the parcel size.
But you couldn't do like townhomes.
Right. So So townhouses and quadplexes, the pathway for that would be a special exception. And if you look actually at the Northgate building, they've actually got townhouse style development along the back of that project. Yeah. Thank you. And thanks for your work on housing.
Mary Chavis, 215 Lawton Street. Continuing the discussion on North Washington, which seems to be predominantly what we're talking about this evening, but North Washington Street was an afterthought. When council first discussed this, the focus was on Park primarily, and to get infill, small infill on Park. North Washington Street was a last-minute addition by council. It already has a small area plan, and I would contend that the small area plan basically limits the height of structures north of Great Falls Street to East Columbia to 3 stories. So the SUP permission to go higher would be inconsistent with that approach. The Planning Commission, as we've discussed, has also added a no residential for this area. And I agree, that's one of the key objectives of the whole approach. So there's some consternation about what are we really doing here? Why are we doing T-zones? Why aren't we focusing on a small area plan for Park to get that right and to reflect the interests of the neighbors and look at a vision and design for Park Avenue? Why include all of the T-zones when they are so diverse? And for North Washington Street, where we've already had a small area plan that governs much of North Washington Street, I'm not sure that it's necessary. The street is already fully developed. We have existing buildings and very little on North Washington Street that's a vacant lot. And so the whole idea of encouraging development where there hasn't been development, I think, is lost on North Washington. I would, again, focus on Park and perhaps not go the T-zone route, but go the small area plan route to really look at Park and get it right there. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sylvia Mom. I live at 207 Pennsylvania Avenue, and I've been in Falls Church City since 1997. So I think that's a really sweet idea, a small area plan for Park Avenue, I will say. So I appreciate that comment. I have a little list of comments here, and they're kind of in the order of your slides. And I want to first thank you for having this town hall and for the paper copy of the slides, because for those of us sitting in the back, I can never see these sideways screens. So I know there was some effort to do this, and I really appreciate it. On the other hand, we didn't know about this meeting until last Thursday when one of our more vigilant neighbors found it on the website. So it would be really good to have a little bit more outreach to get people here, because this reflects, maybe, I don't know, larger numbers who are not here tonight. Okay, so I'm not a planner. I do have some experience in smart growth. I work a lot on water quality. The transition zone concept, I still struggle to see how, looking at that site on Park, how a 4-story building is really a transition. It doesn't, I like the idea of the smaller units that you're talking about now, but a 4-story building, to me, does not seem like a transition zone. It seems like what's on Broad Street already. I think you just mentioned group homes a minute ago, and I was under the commercial section. You were talking about Washington Street and that a group home could go there. And that was one thing I wondered about, because we do have families in Falls Church City whose kids have developmental disabilities or other kinds of issues where they really need some kind of supportive housing, and we don't, Northern Virginia has nothing, really. So I think that it would be good to make sure that that could still happen. We used to have something on Park that was, I think, for pregnant young women. It was in that house opposite the area you all are talking about on Park, right? Yeah, so it's not there now. There's a gigantic house where it used to be, but I think we need to think about housing for all kinds of people. Stormwater quantity. Your paper references a 10-year storm, and that really surprised me, because we're having 100-year storms now in a slightly different time frame. So I'm not sure that a 10-year storm is an adequate plan. I suspect it's not. Affordable housing, I was surprised and disappointed to see that your recommendation takes away the overlay zone that one of the Planning Commission members recommended, and then I guess they passed it. I think affordable housing is really critical. Workforce housing for the teachers who want to, stay here, especially when they're starting out and they don't have families. They could start out in a smaller unit. Police officers, firefighters, I mean, you all know that, but I continue to think that what you all are looking at is very weak on affordable housing. You've taken away the overlay zone. You've put in this cash in lieu of paying having a 10% of the units be affordable. That's just like a get out of jail free card. I just don't feel like you have an opportunity on Park, and we would support it to really do something for affordable housing, and on the other areas too. So I don't feel like this is a serious effort that affordable housing people really care about, and this is not that. Okay, and then some disjointed comments at the end. I guess you mentioned developer review, and I know we have a developer who owns property on Park. I believe it's Bob Young, and I'm hoping he's not directly involved in this. I'm sure that in some ways he might be. Further down Washington Street, the yellow cab site, I think is not going to be there forever. So it seems like you could, bigger units, bigger buildings could be put there, because it already doesn't have that residential feel, and maybe trees could be added to that and it would look better in that area. And maybe more affordable housing there. I don't know, but I feel like we're not talking about that, and you wouldn't get the pushback on a 4-story building, I suspect, in that location. I don't know anything about what's allowable there. Founders Row, I actually looked at Founders Row a couple of times. That new street you mentioned has made the intersection with Park and West really confusing. And I don't think it adds anything in terms of the park access that the gentleman with the hat was talking about. It's just kind of weird. It's not a green space in there. It's a very cement-oriented space. And I think, you're hearing from the residents on the existing building on Broad Street about, missing their trees. And maybe when you just argue from your own self-interest, it's not the most powerful argument, but I really do think they're right, because everybody needs access to nature. And if you're not planning for that, it's going to really affect the quality of life, and that's a very legitimate concern. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Paul. Erin Flynn, 222 Little Falls Street. I've been here a lot. I still do have some various comments. I'll try to outline them somewhat, because I think Ms. Teets sort of captured this in the Planning Commission when she said there's like so much going on here. And when it still doesn't all fit together, we're still just like not getting it right. And maybe we need to go about this a different way, whether it's a small area plan for Park, or whether it's thinking about T1 and T2 and actually splitting Park from North Washington. But we're trying to do a lot in a lot of different places, and it just doesn't seem to be working all that well. But in terms of comments, I guess I have three different things that struck me seeing the new slides. The first was sort of the notion of underutilized properties in the T-zone generally. And this goes back to something that I think John Gannon had talked about in his written submission, which is sort of that, the T-zones are a lot of different properties, and there are also a lot of places that provide social services to the city. And so I guess I'm interested when you're saying underutilized, or when city council keeps saying underutilized, we need to do more. Are you defining that by floor area ratio? Are you defining that by tax base? Because when I look at the map, I see Columbia Baptist, I see Christ Crossman, I see historic properties, I see Sunrise, I see Miller House, and those are not things that if you're doing floor area ratio or you're doing tax base that you're going to capture. And they're always going to look underutilized, but they're providing important services and they're providing important character and sense of place for the city. So I guess that's comment number one. Comment number two, it seems sort of random tonight that for commercial uses, you have this like 4,000 square foot cap on commercial uses on park. And I'm trying to understand where that's coming from, because it seems like it's underutilizing the properties that are there, because alarm.com, I don't know, I just looked on Redfin, is like 2,650 square feet. I think the Case Design and the Ocana is like places around 2,000 square feet. So you wouldn't get a lot more lot coverage by right. And so it makes me a little bit concerned that that might be there because there's plans for a commercial property and we're, accommodating those plans. Because what I had understood is that there was an application for a variance at the corner of Park and Oak for a daycare. And I don't have an issue with the daycare. I think a daycare would be great. It would be something that the city needs. But if we're saying 4,000 square feet to basically accommodate that daycare, I think the city should be like more honest about where the 4,000 square feet came from. And then I guess the last point is that on page 18, if we can just go to like slide 18. I would say that this gets to the concern just about walkability and what Pete was raising about, do you actually get better streetscapes? And here, again, this shows basically the minimum of what would likely end up on that lot, because that's the minimum of the SUP. So if a developer wants to come in and not do a 3 or 4 family home, they're already subject to the SUP, right? And so if they're subject to the SUP, they're not going to minimize their SUP application. They're going to go to the max of their SUP application. And so that likely, right, is going to be 50 feet height, which is what they're allowed to ask for, 70% building coverage, and much smaller setbacks. And in this SUP, I don't see how council is going to say, no, we're not going to allow that multifamily building. And so I do think that there's a real concern about whether we're truly getting missing middle housing and whether we're doing anything to promote a streetscape that's walkable for people and bikeable for people and has the tree canopy that we want in order to kind of enable those conversations people want to have when walking down Park.
So let me I'll take them in order. So first one was about sort of revitalization and
utilization. Because when I look at it, I mean, we're basically talking about like 2 parcels on Park, and frankly, they're like the parcels that are developer owned or the parcel that the landowner has for a long time sought to develop. And so they're holdouts for a more permissive ordinance.
Yeah, there are, if we go back to the T-zone map, there are little spots of T-zones throughout the city. And I think, so sometimes the term underutilized, right? Obviously, when you've got a great civic use, that's not an underutilization. That's a wonderful use, and we should support it as long as we can.
But I mean, but you're not supporting it because like let's say 70% of that is civic sort of uses. If you count historic properties, churches, assisted living facility, and a group home, those are civic uses. And when you change the land value, you are basically asking the next developer to get rid of the civic use.
So just going back to what I was saying, that we are getting in the properties that do have commercial uses in them, we get calls from the commercial brokers saying, you know, my tenant's leaving because they found nicer space. It's not worth it for me to invest in my property and I'm stuck. What can I do? And so we do get people who own these properties or who are the commercial leasing agents for these properties saying these properties are stuck. They can't develop under the existing regulations and they can't charge a low enough rent to make it worthwhile to operate the property. So there are some properties that because of the current rules are stuck, and that's one of the problems we're trying to solve.
But
right?
then maybe you scale that by having like appropriately scaled residential development that gives them more than what they can currently do without like maxing out a new Broadway on Park and Lee.
Sure. Yeah, and that's where we get those conversations with the developers going about, we propose something and could you develop under this? And when we start to hear people say, yeah, I could develop under that, and then we sort of know we've gone far enough to accommodate reinvestment. The second question, if I got it in the right order.
Commercial uses at 4,000 square feet.
Yeah, 4,000 square feet. So this was research that we can credit to the American Planning Association, where they went out and they surveyed what's a typical size for sort of a residential serving commercial use, and they said it was 4,000 square feet. And this is where we were trying to maybe focus the Planning Commission's concerns along Park Avenue, that there was this concern they didn't want this sort of mega commercial user coming in on Park Avenue, which is supposed to be one of the civic great streets. On the flip side, ruling out commercial uses isn't, at least in staff's view, isn't necessarily consistent with a great street either. And so we wanted to find some sort of middle ground, so we relied on that guidance from the APA about what is a neighborhood serving sort of scale commercial user. You asked about Bob Young's application. He does have a paid application in for a daycare, but it is more than 4,000 square feet. So actually, under the current proposal, he would have needed an SUP to move forward with that. But he is coming in with a by right site plan, and we'll be putting that on the Planning Commission's agenda for a work session. We're in March, so it'll be in, I think, mid-April is when he's on for work session.
And then the last one was just kind of a maxed out condo building versus actually promoting quadplexes and triplexes or like appropriately scaled townhouses to what's actually already in the T-zone, which would make it harmonious.
Sure. And so if we can go back to the residential uses. So obviously, Planning Commission was picking up on that need for some sort of by right residential development, and that's where their recommendation came in to allow triplexes and quadplexes by right. And planning staff agrees. We think that's a viable path forward. And then the idea of a townhouse, right? A townhouse, a small condo building. A lot of what drives this is that the parcel size still has to be less than an acre. And since the Broadway is 2.5 acres, and the other developments that are going up around the city, like Founders Row, is almost 4 acres in size now. And so part of this is a sort of swinging the pendulum back, that if the SE projects are about 2, 3, 4 acres at a time, these SUPs are really for 1 acre at a time. And so when you think about, the size limitations, the step backs, and the yards, this is really going to pull these buildings down in comparison to what's getting built today.
And I guess I would, just in response to that, make a pitch again that something that's on a 1 acre lot that's abutting sort of the streets that people heavily use for biking and walking, and that is an alternative to the walking that doesn't happen on Broad Street, shouldn't be 50 feet in height, but should really be scaled to 35 feet or no more than 40 feet when you have flat roofs.
Mm-hmm. All right, thanks.
I'm Ping Heinem on North Lee, so we're still staying on Park Avenue. Some of the T lots that are on Park Avenue today have 20-foot front setback covenances. Why then not just make every lot on Park Avenue 20 feet? Then you have consistency from Founders Row to Washington Street, except for one anomaly, which is the monstrosity called the Spectrum. So I would like to see that 15 feet SUP removed and just leave it as a 20-foot front setback, because there's already a covenant on those lots. Not on all of them, unfortunately. My second issue has to do with stormwater and is related with tree canopy. I'm actually in favor of the suggestion about small area plan for Park Avenue, because I think you would get the buy-in from the neighbors to be able to take part and focus in on the Park Avenue site. So I'm really in favor of the small area plan for Park Avenue. And I totally agree that Washington Street is a completely different animal. So on Park Avenue, the section that you're looking where the T-zones are is extremely wet because there used to be a stream going down the back of Lee Street and probably went across Broad Street into the stream at Howard Herman Park, okay? So that area is a collecting point for water. So we all have groundwater issues because those streams have been taken into pipes underground. Now, all our water cannot reach the stream, so they are pooled in each one of our lots. Like spring the Broadway problem, okay? It doesn't help when Founders Row completely paves their surface. Even if you make them have a tank in there, what's the point? It's in the tank, and the tank is just going to add more to the groundwater. Tanks don't solve anything. We need open ground to absorb the water, to be able to absorb the water, and we need trees to suck up the water and remove it. Now, the trees that we need are not the piddly serviceberry trees that are along in front of the spectrum. The serviceberry, all those skinny trees there that can't grow for lack of light, are not going to do anything for the groundwater. So the trees, you know what kind of trees you need. We need large trees. They are what the Planning Commission has said are the trees that they would like along Park Avenue, large shade trees. Shade trees do not grow in the shade. I just joined the Falls Church Garden Club and I learned a little bit about trees. The very few trees that grow in the shade are 20 to 30 feet tall, and they are scrawny. They will do nothing for our groundwater. Putting trees, at least I know that putting trees in giant flower pots like in Founders Row isn't going to do anything for the groundwater either. I don't know how tree canopy is being calculated, whether if you put a tree in a flower pot, you get points for tree canopy, your 10% tree canopy coverage. If you put a shrub up, does that add to your tree canopy coverage? Okay, we are talking big trees. I hope we are the same mind that what we want is big trees along Park, because Park will look beautiful. My neighbor, who sadly has passed away 10 years ago, described a Park Avenue with giant trees down both sides that she loved to walk down. Now the trees are slowly coming back in front of they were in front of the townhomes. You know, they were taken down to develop the townhomes, but they are coming back. And what I fear is you guys are not paying attention, that we will have no more trees because there is no light. So I propose that for every development, we are not going to agree on heights, okay, and setbacks and everything. But for every development, let's do a light study. And let's be honest. The light study will show whether enough light reaches the ground to allow the trees to grow. Let that be the condition. And don't draw little pictures of nice watercolors showing trees all around your buildings, when in reality, those trees will not grow. You look at the trees around Founders Row along the road. Watch and see how fast they will grow. The trees down North Lee, between Kensington and Broadway, hardly get enough light. They have been there for 20 years almost now. They have not grown very much. So if you don't pay attention to the size of the building to ensure that the light actually reaches the trees that you're going to plant, you will get 10 and 20-foot trees for the rest, if that, for the rest of Park Avenue's life. And it'll be on you. Okay, my other point. You're from Arlington. I'm sure you were paying attention to the Arlington missing middle housing proposals. What surprised me was Arlington thinks that they can get developers to build 4-plex, 6-plex, how many multiplexes, in the footprint of a single-family house on a single-family lot. And now City Council and Planning Commission are really worried that our developers are unable to build on these lots. Therefore, we need to have 70% building coverage max, 10 feet setbacks, et cetera, okay? If Arlington is not worried, why are we worried? So I hope that we are all paying attention to what Arlington is trying to do. The other thing I love about Arlington is about the affordable housing plan. I think they are looking at controlling the square footages of the homes that are being built in order to get more affordable homes and not these million-plus houses. That's a great idea. Well, let's do that. Okay? And then I've been asked by the previous speaker for you to please answer why staff removed the tax overlay for affordable housing.
Sure. Yeah, looking for, certainly you're looking for a response to the last one, so let me speak to that one. So just walking through the timeline here, right? So T-zones today, people can build single-family houses by right, duplexes in some cases, but there's no requirement for any of that to be affordable. That carries market prices. When council referred it out, they recommended that 10% of the new units on site be committed as affordable. The council referred it out not just to the Planning Commission, but also to the Housing Commission, as well as the Environmental Sustainability Council. And one of the comments we got back from the Housing Commission was make sure you allow for a cash in lieu option, because on some of these projects where the scales are smaller, it can be hard to incorporate those on site, but you still want to have the value of that affordable housing. So cash in lieu is a way to get there. The other benefit to a cash in lieu is the option for a fractional system. So if you require strictly 10% of the units on site or fraction thereof, people are going to build 10 units and make one affordable, or 20 units and make two affordable, but they're not going to build 11 units. They're not going to build 21 units because that next unit they build has to be affordable. So the idea of a cash in lieu also allows for fractional contributions. The tax overlay zone that was proposed by the Planning Commission, staff looked into it along with the guidance from the city attorney, and we found that it's not clear that it's workable under Virginia tax law, that when you have it's incorporating something called the tax increment finance law, so a TIF. The idea is that you sort of commit future tax revenues to encourage redevelopment that otherwise couldn't afford itself. So the idea is that you say, okay, well, this building is going to go in and it's going to provide an art space, or it's going to do streetscape, or it's going to build a highway interchange if it's the Mark Center. I don't think they had to pay for a highway interchange. But the idea is that you earmark the future tax revenue from that project to pay for the improvements you want as part of the project. It's a little complex, but under Virginia tax law, it has to be tied to a specific project. And the Planning Commission recommendation was to sort of spread it across sort of like hypothetical development in the T-zones generally, and then spread it throughout the city generally. And so it just didn't, it's not clear that it jives with Virginia tax law. So staff recommends sort of reverting back to that recommendation of making sure that any applicant developer actually contributes to the affordable housing needs in the city by either providing units on site or cash in lieu. Staff is also looking into options to limit the allowable unit sizes. So yes, given the option, people will generally sort of sell to the highest seller or to the highest buyer first. So is there a way through the T-zones that we can actually restrict some of the unit sizes so that some of the units in new production, in new housing are at a smaller square footage and hopefully therefore at a smaller price? I lost track here. Oh, you're back there. Were you looking for like sort of responses to other questions as well? I didn't want to.
I'd like to know your take on trees and stormwater.
Okay, so trees and stormwater. So I'm a fan of trees. Every small area plan I work on has a bunch of trees all over the place. And anytime we work on a CIP project, I ask how many more trees can we fit into the thing. So I'm always looking for spaces to put trees. Light. So one thing is having the ground to plant them in, the other is having the light to support them. And I think that is something we're trying to take a look at. It is on the council's work plan to think about green building design. I know it's one thing that maybe people haven't looked at too much in recent redevelopment is sort of site layout, solar orientation, those kinds of things that go into making a building livable, not just to support the trees to grow, but also can you naturally shade the building? Can you reduce your energy usage? Can you capture your stormwater?
No.
You're worried about stormwater.
No. For the trees to grow, you
Yeah.
need at least 6 hours of direct sunlight.
Sure.
The trees I'm talking about. Now, if you talk to the arborist responded to my previous query about, because Park Avenue runs east-west, which means that the north side gets no light.
The south side.
The north side of the building. The trees are
Yeah.
planted on
Yep.
the north side of the building.
Yep.
They're in the shade.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so there won't be much light reaching it if the building is very tall, which is why the trees in front of Spectrum have a problem.
Yeah, there's sunlight, there's also soil volume. So the city's updated streetscape standards from a few years ago do actually detail a minimum soil volume for trees. It's not the only thing, but it's obviously one component.
Okay, so the arborist's response was that you can plant trees in the shade, but I think the trees that you can plant in the shade are not the trees you and I are thinking of.
Right.
So you need to make sure that there is enough light, 6 hours of sunlight, not diffuse light,
Mm-hmm.
to enable a tree to grow.
Mm-hmm.
And they can only do that with a light study.
All right. Did you also want to talk stormwater or?
If you can plant those trees
Yeah.
and have open land, so you're not 100% impermeable.
Yeah.
I mean, you can get less than 80%, be wonderful, then the water can go in the soil. I mean,
Right. Yeah, so, right, obviously you're looking for places to store the water, right? Underground, right? Before people put basements in, you could store the water in the soil. When you've got a lush tree canopy, the waters are storing trees. So the trees are storing water. So just thinking about all the different ways in the city where you can store water. And I agree with you, that's important. We do have a plan for sort of remaking some of the floodways in the city as well as the stream beds and thinking about restoring some of those streams to their natural function. This idea that stream beds and stream corridors really ought to serve as those places to hold water because you actually don't want it going in people's basements and people's homes. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Karen Jones, and I've been with a resident of the City of Falls Church since 2006. Mm-hmm. And I agree with all these ladies' comments. She stole my script on trees, so that was excellent. So I'll add to that, and I want to talk about the number one reason for weather-related deaths in the U.S., and it's due to heat. The urban heat island effect cannot be underestimated here. It's a huge peril, and 4 out of 5 Americans live in urban centers. The difference in temperature is 10 to 15 degrees versus more rural areas. So it's also a vicious cycle. The hotter it is in the city, the more you have to pump your air conditioner, and it just creates a positive feedback loop, and there's nothing positive about it. You can see this from space. I'm a space professional, and I've been looking at Landsat imagery over the past few years and other types of imagery. And Falls Church is getting hotter. We're seeing it with Founders Row. Small trees and planters do not provide the shade needed. It is going to be an epicenter for an urban heat island. Also, Washington and Broad. 80 trees roughly were removed there, and now that's a massive development. It's going to be another impervious surface. That's typically the dense concentration of pavement causes urban heat islands. We have to think about ways to future-proof Falls Church for climate change. We must start now. I want to mention, because we were talking about streetscapes, and I love Falls Church, I like walking around. University of Washington did a study. Tree-lined areas bring in more retail. If you don't want to stroll into a store, you buy on Amazon. Some of these strip centers are not attracting the type of foot traffic they need. An attractive city center will do that. We are working against the tide. We have to stop shooting ourselves in the foot. We have to think about our future, livability, climate. And I am very, very concerned that the the urban heat island, which wasn't really here in Falls Church a few years ago. You're starting to see it on satellite imagery now. We've got to change that.
Well, Paul, I'm going to try to stick to your plan of trying to go through this, and I'm going to end with commercial, which was your first item that we were going to talk about, because what's not up there, first of all, we did not turn out mobs. The Broadway, which I'm from, could have turned out Kathy Thompson, a lot more people. But since Thursday was the first time anyone officially heard about this, not that we didn't know, we decided we wanted to focus on people who could ask questions. We have people who are going to talk about parking and stormwater or whatever. So I want to say that's why we did not try to pack the room, because we could have. I didn't see a purpose of it, my personally self. Of the 23 units of the Broadway, out of 80 units that abut this property, I'm wondering how many people would have bought the unit. I would never have bought the unit. And we called the city and discussed what could be built 12 years ago behind us. And one thing I said, well, you know, I have to trust the city council is not going to undermine the very first building train that was in the city for 20 years, I'm told, when they put the Broadway. I must admit now that I see basically the staff recommendations are for all purposes identical to the Planning Commission recommendations. I know that I was going to hire someone to spend a lot of money upgrading our bathrooms. I'm not doing that because I know the value of my unit has dropped. We all just got our real estate assessments. And I want to know, have you studied, and will you include a study to the city council, what you expect to happen to the value? I know you all talked about how the property is going to be more valuable in the T-zones when you finish this. Some of us definitely will have trouble selling it for what the real estate assessment is now when this process finishes. I hate to say, because people like myself would have said what could be built behind me, and when you look out my terrace, you will see a building 4 feet lower than what I'm in 15 feet away is going to be a problem. But first of all, my first question is, I'm mystified. Don't we really have 3 T-zones now? I mean, your proposal is North Washington's going to have its rules. Park Avenue will basically have its rules, and there's a few miscellaneous zones. I have walked and sent a memo on every single one of these. And the East End property is disappearing, and the parking lot. South Washington has its own plan. So do you disagree that basically in the near future there'll be more than 3 acres, the 2 blocks south side of Park, and the little property, the 2 parcels off Hillwood? Do you really expect any change to happen we'll give you a 3 or 4 year time period? Do you expect any besides Park Avenue and perhaps the Hillwood properties? Do you really expect that people are going to be ripping down properties along North Washington to benefit from this T-zone change?
So the question is about sort of the pace of development?
Pace of anything beyond Park Avenue for all practical purposes, that the Planning Commission, every discussion they had kept coming back to the 2 blocks of Park Avenue. Do you think this is anything other than the 2 blocks of Park Avenue?
Well, I think those are the ones people have been talking about the most, because obviously there have been sort of developers looking at it for the last several years. So, oh gosh, I'm sorry. So the question is, are other T-zones sort of considered to be potentials for redevelopment in the near term? And I think the answer to that is probably in the near term, no, that it takes a while for development to take hold, that it's a lot of money at stake, it's a lot of due diligence that has to happen. And I think adopting this zoning ordinance may get people thinking about what they could do with their T-zones where maybe they thought there really isn't another future. So it may get some of these conversations going, but it can be a couple years before those proposals come in. And so I think if this goes through, yes, you'd probably see the most activity along Park Avenue, because those are the parcels people have already been talking about for a couple years. The other parcels could come into play later as people get familiar with the zoning change.
Such as some of the other parcels, just generally you'd have in mind those parcels being ripping down Kaiser Permanente?
Well,
unlikely.
no, they're probably not going to take down the Kaiser. So, but it could be something about, what happens if there is a redevelopment proposal for, say, the 24-hour fitness site. At least gives them some guidance about what we're expecting. We're not expecting you to rezone the whole thing one and.
Well,
and
I thought that I already read that you have written in the staff report you would expect that to become B1 because it's the parking lot of So I'm assuming that's going to be B1 if you bother putting that in a staff report.
So they could rezone yeah, so this is a lot of hypotheticals, and a lot of this is sort of what's the underlying zoning pattern, but I think this is sending a signal that we do expect design transitions from the taller commercial as it butts up against single-family residential, and I think you can sort of see that play out in the proposal here, although I know...
But that would be really a special exemption that you would do under a B1.
Sure.
Okay, well, as I said, most of us view that this has to do with 2 blocks of Park Avenue, but I'm the only one who even brings up the Hillwood property, because that's the one that could have been built immediately under the city's proposal of last May, and everyone said that would make sense. My son lives a block or so away. Leslie's might have a little challenge there, but let me ask you a question about the whole process for a minute before I stick back to commercial.
Sure.
Okay, I am still in wonderment how this whole process went. Would Fairfax Board of Supervisors and Arlington County Board have handled this whole thing the same way, where they would have started with a board, put it out, and then the public has been trying to get any opportunity to talk less than 3-minute intervals when we insist? Does this process make sense to most people? Wouldn't this come up through the planning committee and planning commission and the zoning boards and get input? But this seemed to have started top down, and now we're having something that's been underway for almost 2 years. Do you think this is a logical process? Does it go the same way the counties around us would approach this?
So in terms of, I've heard that a lot that came out of nowhere. And it is why I sort of included the comments from the comp plan. Actually, if we go back to that comp plan page, I think it's way back in the beginning. But each of the comprehensive plans going back to, so starting with the more recent updates, the 2014 update to mobility for all modes, that in the parks chapter a year later, we got to demographics, housing, environment. All of those chapters do come with, obviously, a vision council, planning commission, community is trying to achieve, and then specific action items that they want to take in order to get them to that vision. And these quotes are actually coming out of those plans. So these are ideas that sort of bubbled up from that community engagement, from the boards and commissions, from the key stakeholder groups that drive these conversations. And then when council gives direction to say, okay, this is one of the short-term action, staff, we want you to start working on it. It is, I think, that turn of saying, okay, we've had this bubbling up of the community, landing on a vision for what the city should be in the future. And now, staff, we want you to start carrying this out and start working through the specific steps.
But there's not a small area plan for the Great Street of Park Avenue, the whole street right now, correct? You said we need to probably do something like that, or someone said that?
So Park Avenue has design guidance from 2 different small area plans. So there is the downtown small area plan, cover Washington to Little Falls, and then West Broad would pick up from that point all the way down to the WNOD. And so both of those plans do provide a vision for the future of Park Avenue. There's actually standard streetscapes with wider sidewalks and street trees, and canopy trees on both sides of the street to provide that urban design and that great shade tree environment for Park Avenue.
I have a bunch of other things I'm not going to say, but what I'm going to bring up is commercial.
Sure.
The commercial part, I think it's a good idea to not necessarily prohibit it, but I think it should have a close look on Park Avenue, and North Washington is where the focus is. But having talked to you, or my husband talking to you, I know there's been no discussion about what was developed by staff as what's in those commercial uses. And some of them are, hate to say, hilarious. A bookstore is not going to open along there. We're amazed we still have Barnes & Noble around here. But someone between now and April 24th has really got to take a hard look at some of those things. But I'm going to bring up my favorite one to you, Paul, that you've heard again and again. And you had months to tell me. Medical offices are allowed, hospitals are allowed, but we have added clinics for human care. And I bet you're now going to tell me finally, what is a clinic for human care? I've speculated that it has to be because the abortion clinic is on South Washington, one of the T-Zone properties, but what is a clinic for human care that is even put back in rather than just taken out of your list? What is that?
Sure. So clinic for human care, it's defined in the city zoning ordinance, but it's a medical facility with 3, hopefully I'm quoting, but it may be a paraphrasing here, but it's an outpatient medical facility with 3 or more doctors.
which is Patients First, which is every medical office that exists along Park Avenue, I assume. How does it differ?
Yes, well, because it would be specifically for surgical procedures versus, say, like an in-office visit.
For surgical, unlike the hospital, but this is just in-house versus out-house.
Right.
So I'm not sure we desperately need one of those on Park Avenue, maybe on North Washington, but I just bring up, I urge everybody, I swear I'm the only one who keeps asking questions about all the information, because Paul, you just said basically you sorted and cut in about half the permissible commercial activities for B1 zones and said, oh, these sound not right. And no one has talked about those at all. So I urge, before that goes back to the council's next work session, will someone please say, how useful, wise are these commercial activities?
Sure.
Since they still would not be prohibited along Park Avenue. Thanks.
Sure.
And I know we're going to go past 10 because I know a lot of my colleagues over here have other questions, and I'll be back if they don't get to them.
Awesome. Thank you.
I'm Meredith Anderson. I live in a townhouse in the Winter Hill community. I'm also the chair of the Housing Commission. I've been on the Housing Commission for a few years now. And I just want to say I appreciate the sort of evolution and of the affordable housing, bringing that, what's generally been like a consideration in the larger buildings, like incorporating that idea of contributing to affordable housing in these smaller plot sizes, smaller numbers of units and things like that. I think that, having the cash in lieu option will definitely provide a lot more flexibility. And I know I've heard comments where people said like, oh, this doesn't do enough for affordable housing. Given that there's so much the city is doing right now for affordable housing, I think T-zones are really valuable as just sort of making one area, a small area of the city, more efficient. And we have a lot of other places where we're putting a lot of investment and money into affordable housing. And I think this complements that very well while providing the use for affordable housing. I think that, even if it's used for all these other things too, I think it's still a really valuable step in just kind of making, continuing to move the zoning forward and just make it less complicated. I had a question about the unit size limitations note that was in the staff piece. Have you seen that done? I was just wondering where you guys had come up with the idea. Is that something you've seen successfully done in other places, or yeah, that was my question.
So I'm going to give credit to our other town hall where someone said the comment of, hey, why don't you guys look at smaller unit sizes as a way to bake in some affordability. And actually the reverse is true. You can actually see this in zoning ordinances and jurisdictions where they'll actually set minimum unit sizes in order to drive up the prices. And so I think in theory, it should work, and that's why we're going to look at it before we bring it back to council.
Cool, thanks.
Yep, thank you.
Hi, my name is Grayson Timoner. I'm at 509 Roosevelt Boulevard. I just want to say I really appreciate that the City and Planning Commission are taking on outdated zoning codes. And I wanted to thank you guys and the Planning Commission so much for your work to make the city more livable. I think this is a good step in the right direction in making Falls Church a more walkable and enjoyable place to live. And I also wanted to acknowledge really quick that I think there's so many people that are in favor of this, but they're just too busy to come and support. And you can see that reflected in the demographics of people that can come to things like this. Like I live in Falls Green, which has tons of young people like me, tons of families with young children, and people like in my, I think I'm the only person from my apartment complex here, and I think it's just because people of my demographic, and I think a lot of people with young families just have more to do on an average night like this. But I can tell you, I've talked to people in my apartment complex, and there's tons of people in favor. They're just too busy to come on a night like tonight. And so I wanted to bring it back to like the vibrancy of streets, back to the gentleman with the first question, who was touching on Jane Jacobs. So I actually think this would make our streets more vibrant, and I wanted to ask what more walkable places near here, like parts of DC or Arlington or Old Town, what do you think those places are doing right? And why are they so much more walkable that we're not doing? And how does this get us closer to a more walkable place like those places?
Sure. So, sort of what does it take to make a place walkable? And thank you for coming out tonight. So what does it take to make a place walkable? I think a lot of it has to do, you have to have sort of interest and you have to have comfort. So if you think about a place like Old Town Alexandria, it's not necessarily a comfortable place to walk. Sometimes the sidewalks are a little wobbly, they're a little bit small, but it's very interesting. There's restaurants, there's people, there's architecture, there's a lot going on. There are a lot of different, on foot, there are a lot of different things you can see in Old Town in a short amount of time. And that's why it continues to be sort of a gem within Northern Virginia. And when you think about the other neighborhoods with names, when you think about, say, an Adams Morgan or a Georgetown, and they all have their own feels, but there are all these, or even the Mosaic District, right? What makes the Mosaic District interesting is that you can drive there, get out of your car, and then for that half day or however long you're there, you're doing all your stuff on foot and you're passing interesting things and you're engaging with the people around you, with the environment, with the stores, with the shops. And I think that is one of the keys that's driving vibrancy in Falls Church. It's when you go to these blocks where you either have the older strip centers that are commercial, that are successful, like a Broaddale. They're fully leased, they're active, they're uses people use every day, or they're the redeveloping properties, like the Harris Teeter's got a grocery store that's within a 10-minute walk of half the city's population, or at Northgate where it's got those everyday retail uses. So when you see those active uses that people can make use of every day, I think that's what it takes to make a place vibrant.
Thanks again.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Hi, good evening. I'm Pat Abarano. I live in the Broadway, and I'm on the 3rd floor, and my unit faces the back, so I look out over the T-zone. And I'm here to talk about the tree canopy, and I'm glad to hear you're a tree person. I saw the slide 14, where it talks about the tree canopy, and I'm really happy to see that there is a recommendation for this from the staff regarding the tree canopy. Right outside my window, along the back of the T-zone lot, from the middle of the lot, and then heading down towards Lee Street, there's a stand of about 5 or 6 huge, beautiful trees, at least 40, 50 feet or more. What are the chances of those surviving whatever happens in that T-zone lot? Because I know, we talk about wanting to keep tree canopy, but, I was a little alarmed from what Peng was saying and talking with the arborists that unless they get so much sunlight, if there's a big structure now that goes up on that lot, are all those trees going to end up having to be cut down, or are they going to be cut down? What is your recommendation? Would it be to conserve those huge, glorious trees back there?
Yeah, so there are a couple things that obviously there's a goal of maintaining trees. You can see it, though, even in sort of single-family development throughout the city. We lose a lot of the trees there as well. I think two of the things that sort of drive tree loss during construction, one is the limits of disturbance. Can you keep the project design outside of the root zone, sort of generally out from under the drip line of the trees? And the reason that can be so difficult to achieve is that even if the building envelope doesn't extend into that critical root zone, typically you have to regrade the property to accommodate the development, because generally you want a level floor plate to accommodate ADA. And so you end up with having to regrade the site, and then as a result of that, the land disturbance puts the tree at risk. I think one of the ways we can try to work trees back into these areas as part of redevelopment is actually through street trees, where we can get the trees on the far side of the sidewalk so that they are farther away from the building. That does at least get them a little bit out of the shadow, give them more soil volume in that panel.
That wouldn't really address the back end of the lot, though, because there's no sidewalk. It's just the property line and then the Broadway. And so, it would take generations to have trees. It would be horrible to lose them, but that's my concern, is that we would lose those trees. I do have a question, though. When you come to your recommendation on the 15% tree canopy, is that in consultation with the city arborist or urban forestry department? I don't even know what the difference is between those two.
So the urban forester is a staff position responsible to the city manager, and then the urban forestry commission is an advisory group answerable to. So it is that sort of coming together of sort of professional staffing, civic guidance to make a better city. Now I'm sort of waxing poetic about boards and commissions, but I do like them. That's why I go to them twice a month. That advice, Urban Forestry did provide a recommendation on tree canopy. They recommended 13%. We thought that going all the way up to 15%, which is the maximum allowable under state code, was the right thing to do for the T-zones. State code establishes a lot of state law is around protecting property rights while also allowing for local control and jurisdiction. So the state does set the allowable maximums for how much tree canopy can be required. And 15% in this case is the maximum.
Because I like that photo. That's what I got now. I'm a little concerned that with the development, those trees, because they're not along Park, along the pretty avenue, the great avenue, they're in the back, but a lot of people see them and they provide a true canopy. I do have a question, Founders Row, the trees that are there now, is that considered a 15% canopy at Founders Row?
No, so they didn't make 15% in terms of their canopy coverage. We report those numbers, and I can't remember offhand what it is for Founders Row.
Okay, so that doesn't, okay.
No.
But if there were similarly sized, little spindly 15-foot trees, that would be, is that more likely of what would be?
So tree canopy is calculated as sort of what happens when the tree reaches sort of either a 10-year growth or a 20-year growth. It models sort of what the expected canopy is. And those numbers do get reviewed by the city arborist so that he can give them a professional eye.
I'm here to plug keeping a canopy in the back. Thanks.
Yep, thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael Doctor. I'm also a Broadway person. I'm also a member of your Public Utilities Committee for Stormwater, although I'm not speaking to that today. There'll be some things that come in. Most of my questions or comments, I'm trying to apply to what's actually in your presentation or what's in what I understand to be your ordinances. So I'm trying to provide comment on your changes. And there's a lot of little ones, so I'll try to deal with them one at a time. I also have some comments on things that came up in the council meeting 2 weeks ago. So 2 weeks ago, Mr. Duncan made a comment that in the single-family area, some of our older homes were being torn down and larger footprint homes were going up. And now we had people in neighboring homes who are looking out their windows right at one another. In the single-family residential area, that's a minimum of 20 feet on a second-story building that has the physical impression of looking right at your neighbor. So I want to just impress that the setbacks and the building heights really matter for that physical impression for how close things are. So when you talk about the setback values, they really have a enduring impact, particularly as the buildings get larger. So the first was just the comment on that comment. That's the best case, single family to single family. We're talking about the other cases here. Second question was Ms. Hardy brought up that townhouses had a parking requirement that was at 2.5 cars per unit. And if you could go to that particular slide. The rationale behind that was that townhomes are assumed to not have street parking. And so townhome developments had to provide the parking in lots within their spaces. And the townhome typically does not have the capacity to have a car park in front of it the way a single-family home does. But if you had a townhome development that had driveways or garages, those counted towards a townhome development's total count. The thing I want to point out here is now you're talking about properties that aren't buried somewhere in a residential area. You're talking about Park Avenue and South Washington Street. You're not going to have overflow parking available. So whereas I agree 2.5 is probably generous and that our habits as a suburban community have changed, going down to 1 is probably severe, and your Lincoln at Tinner Hill is not really a equivalent item to what's going to go on a transitional lot. So the items you've used as your recent projects don't really apply the best metric. So I agree with going down from 2.5. I strongly suggest that 1 is a very severe number and particularly on Park or Washington, you would want it higher. Third thing I want to talk about is I have read your ordinances as I understand them. So I go to the City of Falls Church site, takes me to a library site, and says, these are the existing ordinances. And I have some difference of opinion as to what I think they say compared to what you're presenting. So if I could get with you two gentlemen at some point to discuss that off-site from this, I would appreciate that.
Sure.
But what specifically is in there that I see is something called a buffer zone. So between any two different areas, you're required to have a buffer zone, which falls under your arborist forestry of a certain size. And this particularly goes to what the two ladies talked about, where if between a T-zone and a commercial zone, T-zone and a residential zone, you have a buffer, which is typically 7 to 10 feet. That's not really part of the setback or the total land. That's an excellent way to preserve your old growth trees. Just wanted to, so nowhere in this presentation did I see buffer zone.
Sure. So this is, it's a funny thing about, well, it's not that funny. It's a strange thing about development ordinances that different pieces of the development ordinance pick up different requirements, and you have to meet all of them. So you have to meet the setback requirements, and that tells you, you know, in one instance where the building can be placed, you have to meet the landscaping requirements, which introduce, you're right, it introduces buffer requirements. And the reason we didn't show them here is because it varies based on what the two sort of adjoining zoning districts are.
Not for T. So it's all going to be the A call out.
So it's a tough table. We can certainly include it in future materials just to make sure we're providing full disclosure. And then the other thing we didn't include here is building code. So building code is obviously going to dictate whether you can have windows on a building face and how many openings you can have and how you have to fire rate. And so, like I said, through these review processes, we make sure that every building, every new building is meeting all the requirements.
Okay.
You're correct.
Thank you. Next question has to do with use of the property to try to address the affordable housing. So if you could go to the slide that shows the possible Lee and Park development. So thank you. So we talked about here are the various limitations and what's the various heights. Currently, if you built a townhouse anywhere in Falls Church, it would be maxed out at 35 feet, more or less 2.5 stories. If I built a townhouse taller than that, if I asked for a variance to go taller, I'm adding a floor, I'm adding square footage. I'm really not targeting an affordable property. So there sort of is a kind of these opposing forces for a typical T-zone 1 acre or less slot where townhouses sound like a way to go. That's an awesome way to do transitional, stay under 35 feet. But that's probably not going to address your affordable housing. If you have a 3-story townhome, you're not going to be an affordable home. You have less than 3-story townhomes prolific throughout the community already. So there's something that hasn't really been addressed between those two things. And it's just sort of like a discontinuity.
Sure. So just to say that this is right, obviously we're talking about sort of maximum heights here, and realize with the SUP process, we only showed one concept here, right, and full disclosure, SUP allows for a potentially taller height subject to council review. One product that people are starting to build in other jurisdictions is what's called a 2/2, where instead of one townhouse going from sort of the ground to the roof, it's actually 2 floors stacked over 2 floors. And so that taller height, a 50-foot height, could potentially allow for a 2/2 concept.
Okay. Thank you for the clarification. When I'm envisioning it, I said, I'm convinced almost everyone who sees these lots, the developers, the council members, the planning people, all see something in their head that they think it's going to look like, and that no one's actually envisioning the same thing. But you have a large variety of things that look a lot like what you're talking about within Falls Church right now, and so I appreciate that you showed some. Another property that I think is very analogous to this is you have T-zone properties that have been made into over unders, and that's what's on your Park Washington behind State Theater. And so, to me, that's probably your best analogy for what you would do where it's in a T-zone, it's in an over-under condition, it is a townhome, it is an affordable property because it is smaller square footage. And so, we've talked about the affordable. If you're going to be in a Falls Church zip code, location, the next thing is going to be what's the total square footage of the property. So what you're really talking about is you're trying to build something that's smaller than what's currently there. So I'd say that's one of your good examples. Last thing, if you could go to the slide that's sort of your zoning overall slide.
The map?
The map, yeah. So what strikes me on this is only about half of Falls Church, but if I was to add up the grand total of everything that you call T-zone, and somebody in the meeting 2 weeks ago has a lovely spreadsheet that does that, that looks to me like about 4% of your total land.
It's 3%.
Wow, I'm impressed I was that close. And if you would go to your slide with your 3 bar charts at the beginning, the concept that you're going to significantly impact your increase in housing using 3% of your available land, I think is a fallacy. In my analogies, I think about Alito's Pizza, and we're talking about 1/6 of one slice of that pizza and saying, somehow we're going to help solve this problem for growth using this little tiny piece of pizza. So I'm going to feed the community with just this portion of one slice. When you have, back to your lovely map, the dark area is your multi-use area. You have so much prolific multi-use and even special use planning, some of which you've done things like this in your zone off of, call it Hillwood. What's the street that parallels Broad?
To the south, it's Hillwood. To the
Hillwood.
Yeah.
So you have a special zone, which is really what I think you're doing here, is what you did in that special zone, which is sort of a commercial hotel-like property. That's what you're talking about, trying to do in your T-zones, 3 to 4 story with some more affordability. That's the appearance that I think you're talking about. You have so much land to do this, and your gray bar is probably Tinner Hill, Buchanan, what's across from Tinner Hill, what you're going to get off your multi-use properties. So the idea that you're going to significantly impact your future plan with 3% of your land, I think isn't necessarily intellectually honest.
So that is something that we talk a lot. So regionally, the housing directors get together once a month. The planning directors get together once a month. Sometimes we meet together. And one of the big issues that we always bring up is that there isn't going to be one solution to housing supply problem, and there isn't going to be one solution to the affordable housing supply problem. So if you look at what the council's already doing, they're negotiating for units, and they're negotiating for more units in the special exceptions. It used to be 6%, now it's 10%. Founders Row 2 was 12% of the units. They're using partnering with the EDA to purchase existing market rate affordable housing and secure those as market rate for the long term, partnering with nonprofit providers to run those. They're using Amazon grant funds to buy market rate housing and turn that into affordable home ownership programs. So there's a whole suite of solutions. And if you look into the housing chapter, there's a whole range of sort of regulatory changes that are proposed, whether it's detached accessory dwelling units or allowing duplexes, expanding the provisions for cottage housing, that no one of these things on its own merit is going to solve housing. But the idea is that together, as they all move through, and they're right ones to move first, and that's where we look to guidance from council of staff, go work on this, or staff. And that's what we do. That it's in its entirety. It's that complete picture that puts together the puzzle to solve housing.
Okay. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hi. I'm Sandy Mitchell. I'm a excuse me. I'm a resident of the Broadway, and Mike talked about a little bit of about parking, but I wanted to talk some more about parking. Parking is a perennial problem in the city, I know. So at 1 parking space per home, and if there are townhouses or quadplexes or whatever we're talking about, there's sure to be people who need 2 cars in 1 unit to get to work. There's sure to be visitors who will come in the evenings. How about the cousin from out of town who comes to visit for a week, whatever? My grandkids come and stay with me. What's going to happen in those situations? Will these people be allowed to park on the streets? Will there be more 2-hour parking signs going up? Will their cars be towed? What do you foresee is going to happen? I know there are fewer and fewer cars per family. I understand that statistic, but there's still more than one either in the house or visitors.
Sure. So there are a lot of households in the city that have more than 1 car. I think, what is it? 2/3 of owner-occupied homes have 2 or more cars, and then the reverse is true for renter-occupied homes. So I think some of this is sort of providing it's sort of marrying together this idea of sort of building regulations and transportation planning, that if you build lots of housing with lots of parking, then the people who will move in will bring lots of cars. So some of this is, if you don't want to invite more car traffic, then just don't build the parking spaces and there won't be any. But you also need to protect against overflow parking, and you do need to have some sort of rationale for making sure that we're not building sort of an unsustainable pattern. So there are sort of parking controls in a lot of commercial areas around 2-hour parking, and we just rolled out some no overnight parking adjacent to some of the commercial areas to make sure that these larger apartment buildings are providing enough parking on site without spilling over into surrounding neighborhoods. We have talked to some developers that even if the parking requirement were 1 car per home, they might build 2 anyway for some townhouses. So some of this is on the townhouse side, people are going to build enough parking to meet whoever they think their buyer is going to be. So some of this is level setting, that if you want to build a condo project in the city and you think the buyers are only going to have 1 space, then it's okay to build 1 space per unit. So it's giving people that flexibility.
But still, they couldn't have visitors, couldn't have people over for dinner.
Well, there's still on-street parking, and so,
But I
certainly
see that becoming less and less. No overnight, 2 hours, all that kind of thing.
Right, and there are also a lot of other ways to get around the city. More and more, we're seeing people use ride-hailing. I think it was a couple years ago, DC, I don't know if it's still on the list, but a couple years ago anyway, DC made the list of cities where it was cheaper to actually use ride-hailing all the time than it was to own a car. I'm not sure if Falls Church is there yet, but it is kind of a movement to getting out of auto ownership and just thinking about it as transportation.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
I'm Nancy Ingressano. I've lived at the Broadway for 9 years. I own the place. And I'm sure you know a lot about this, but at the Broadway, it's home to 80 families. 27 of those families face TZone properties on Park Street. 23 of those families are on property lines with TZones. 7 of those families can see nothing but TZones from all their windows and balconies. So whatever happens there is all they will ever see. 4 of those families are affordable housing units. On the other side of Park Street, of those same TZones, between Pennsylvania and North Lee, there are only 4 traditional detached homes. Of course, all of our owners pay city taxes, real estate taxes, and are very interested in these proposed changes. I think that, like me, many of them are concerned about the value of their investment and their future financial well-being. And we are concerned that with TZone changes and with special exceptions, our property values are going to decrease. I have a few questions related to all of this. Has the city made any financial analysis of the changes in Broadway property values, particularly those facing T-zone properties, resulting from the maximum implementation of T-zone proposals?
So the short answer is no. We did run a fiscal analysis with the help of the assessor as well as the Economic Development Office about what might happen on the T-zones themselves. And I think we could probably go back to those same experts and ask them, can you give us some thought about what might happen to the values? Now, I do want to be cautious, right? Because there are two questions to address there. One is the value of the homes, because obviously people use those in an investment, and I want to be sensitive to that. And also the use of that property, right? That it may be one thing to sustain the value, but obviously the design and the enjoyment of that unit is also important as well. So
right.
I think we'd probably want to answer both questions.
Well, that's what I'm getting to. So will you request a valuation review?
Yeah, we can put that on our
Good.
to-do list. Yeah.
Has the T-zone made any drawings which would illustrate what Broadway residents would see looking out on maximum implementation of the proposals?
Well, it's kind of a funny thing, because by right today, there's a question about feasibility versus by right, but by right today, someone could put a 45-foot building wall on the property line. And under the current proposal, they're not allowed to do that. And so the current proposal is already introducing a setback requirement that doesn't exist today, and introducing a step back requirement. And so the proposal on the table actually pulls the building back from what could happen by right today. So there is already some built-in protection. And then the other piece of protection is that if they are to go forward, any sort of application would be subject to council review, so it wouldn't be by right for those building heights. And one of the required considerations is about what is the design transition.
But no one can see what we would see outside all of our windows. So how can anybody evaluate your proposals if they can't see what it looks like? This is of no value in view of all the property tax-paying people who live in the Broadway.
Right. I think to answer that question, I think what you're asking is
You're looking from Park Street.
Sure.
Let's look out my window.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we can certainly put something together to answer that specific question. I think what we would probably do is maybe guess a floor height and guess a location in the building.
I think it's important to use the maximum proposals.
No, I'm saying pick a vantage point within the building. I don't want to flood people with, a view from every window.
I'm on the second floor.
Sure. All right, we do second floor. Yeah, we can probably do two views from the second floor, what you could do by right today in the T-zones versus, what would be the maximum building potential in the proposal.
Great.
Sure.
Great. Has the city written any document naming the impacts to the Broadway and its residents resulting from maximum implementation of matters such as stormwater, tree canopy, vegetation, sunlight, views of nature, and available parking in the neighborhood? Has anybody written an analysis of how we are going to be impacted for all these different areas with maximum implementation of your proposals?
Sure. So I think that's what we're trying to show in terms of assessing the minimums and the maximums that would be allowable under the various envelopes and the tree canopy requirements. Some of that does take a fitting to individual parcels. I think this is probably the first time we've done a specific rendering for a specific property. I guess I'm not sure what.
I'm trying to point out that the residents of the Broadway
Sure.
are numerous.
Yeah.
Your analysis are all from the few people that live on Park or the miscellaneous people who walk down Park Street. But we live with this 24/7. Myself, I live on the second floor. All of my windows face T-zone. So unless I go outside, and I'm not going to live outside, the only thing I see is what you're going to allow, the maximum that you're going to allow in front of my face, 10 feet away.
Can we go back to the sort of approval process? Right, I think this is one of the things that council set the message on early on when we started talking about this in 2021, that they wanted final approval on these buildings because they wanted to be able to consider those design transitions. And that's why council has made clear, and the Planning Commission agreed with them, that they need the final approval on these buildings. And I have seen the council deny SE applications because they had the wrong building design. They didn't have the right taper to the neighborhood. They didn't have the right design considerations. They didn't have enough tree canopy. Those are all reasons.
Yeah, but you're allowing 50 feet.
Right. I guess we may be having a disconnect. Maybe we need to connect offline. But what I'm hearing is sort of concerns about designs and tree canopy and neighboring views. And those are all things that get reviewed in the applications, and those are all things that Council and Planning Commission both take very seriously.
But the point I'm trying to make is, all of your illustrations are from the front.
Sure.
You are ignoring what happens on the back.
Right. No, and I saw he was jotting down notes. So we're going to come up with 2 renderings from the second floor of what you can do today by right and what you could do under the maximum development proposal.
Well, I think you should also be summarizing how all these families will be impacted with stormwater, tree coverage, views, sunlight. These are very important things. Thank you for your consideration.
Hi, my name is Dee Lord. I live at 414 Great Falls Street. I do not live at the Broadway. I went over to see it today for the first time so I could see what people were talking about. And having seen it, I understand completely what they're talking about. And I have a general question for you, and that is, where in your analysis is there a reflection of the fact that the people who are in this room, who are in the Broadway, and people like me who share the concern for the diminution in the quality of life that this plan will inevitably bring, where is that reflected in your analysis? If it's not here, do you talk about it behind closed doors? Do you talk about it with the city manager? Do you talk about it with the developers? We know you talk to the developers. Who makes the decision that we're not going to talk to these people who are in this room? Who makes the decision that we're not going to talk to the neighbors who are most intimately and directly impacted by this proposal? We will look at what the city council says, the staff says, the planning commission says. Where is the column for the neighbors of this development?
Sure. So if we go back to the process, because that is important, right? There are a lot of stakeholders involved, and obviously...
No, it's more than important, because you're rolling over these people, okay? You're doing them in. You're taking money out of their pocket. You're diminishing their enjoyment of life, and that's okay with you. And I want to know, who makes that decision? Do you make it? Does somebody else make it? That we are not going to negotiate with these folks. No, we're going to go ahead and do what we want to do. Who makes that decision?
So I want to object to sort of the language of I'm personally or professionally rolling over people.
I'm sorry for the language, but this is like the 3rd or 4th such meeting that I've attended.
Correct.
And at the Planning Commission, the chairman of the Planning Commission says, I don't know why we're spending so much time on T-zones. It's because these folks are taking a hit and they live here now. They're not future residents, they're current residents. They pay taxes and they vote. Who is representing them in this dispute?
Sure. So development regulations are are tough, right? Especially in a place like Falls Church where you're not doing greenfield development. You're not taking farms down and putting in single-family houses. It's now going that next step. This is sort of the evolution of places, right? So, Falls Church was a forest, and then it was American Indian settlements, and then it became sort of suburban development. And now it's going that next level of development to become a walkable sort of urban area within DC, and that's tough. You're taking down the stuff that's already here. You're seeing creative destruction, and that's hard. That's why projects like this go through such a scrutiny of review when they come in. It's why SE applications take 2 years to review, because these things do get looked at. They get looked at seriously. Decisions are made by council, they're elected. Decisions are made by planning commission, they're appointed. Staff's role is to provide advice and professional recommendations, but ultimately it's the elected officials and the appointed officials that make decisions.
Right. You're telling me that the ultimate resolution is political, and I understand that. I want to know where in your analysis as a city planner
Sure.
is the interest of these folks represented?
Sure. So specifically, that is in the urban design configurations about introducing a step back that's not already required, introducing a step back on the upper floors that's not already required, requiring a tree canopy minimum that's not already required. So these are all levers that we're pulling on as city planners to try and make these greener, more sustainable sites and make them better neighbors.
But when this lady says to you, and I don't want to belabor the point, I'm not going to be able to see anything but a brick wall 10 foot out of my window. And you say that's tough, that's the answer? That's tough, that's evolution? Is
No,
that
I'm
your
not
answer?
saying that that's just tough. I'm saying that that's better than the current state, and I'm not saying that that's going to be the final answer either. Like I said, all these things go through design reviews. When people come in for pre-application meetings, we tell them, watch out for the building next to you. You got to provide a design transition. You got to provide light and air. We tell these things to people when they come in.
Right.
Council asks those questions. Planning commission asks those questions.
But we've come to a point.
Only 30 feet tall, even though the single-family house next to it is taller, because we wanted to make sure there was a good transition across Ellison.
Right.
So I guess I'm getting kind of heated here, because
Well,
I
I
feel
am
like
too.
I'm being accused of rolling people over.
Well, that's the way it feels, because no matter what we do, no matter how often we come here and we say, we don't like this plan, we would like to do something different that still provides for affordable housing, that still provides for housing where it's needed or building where it's needed, but we do not like this plan because it is oppressive. It oppresses maybe a minority of people, but it also oppresses people like me who don't want to walk around on a street that's jammed with people looking for a place to park. And I also live here, and we're not seeing you, for instance, saying, you know what, we hear you. We're going to recommend that we go back and we look at this again.
Well, can we go back to the timeline? Because I guess, I mean, that's the reason I think sort of we walked through the proposal in the order we did. Right, this has been sort of a 2-year process getting to that point. And all these individual pieces, right, we started with sort of what can you do today? What did council suggest? What did planning commission suggest? And that planning commission period, they did host listening sessions. They had public comments during most of their meetings. And we had the league forum. And so there was a series of events where people were encouraged to come out, participate, tell us what you think. And I think what you see in that planning commission recommendation is them trying to make sense of, what is the housing need in the region? What's the housing need in Falls Church? What are the design considerations we ought to make for TZones? What are the specific neighbors to some of these properties saying? And I think that's how we landed on the recommendation we did is getting all that stakeholder input and putting together the best proposal.
Let me ask you this, and then I'll go away. Can you put a column, maybe not forever, but maybe forever, who knows? Can you put a column in your presentation in the future, neighbor reaction, for each of those aspects of your presentation? Neighbor reaction, nearby resident reaction, so that there's a record of the fact that these people were here, they told you what the problem was, and this machine doesn't just keep rolling over them. There's at least an acknowledgement that they were here and they spoke and of what they said. Can you do that?
Yeah, we can probably find a way to summarize sort of public comment.
I'd like a column. They're entitled to a separate column, aren't they? They're as important as the commissions and the developers.
Well,
What
we got
they
to find
say
a
is
legit
important.
to it, right? I mean, we can sort of summarize who came out to a meeting or who provided written comment, and obviously all written comments always go to the council and the planning commission.
Yeah.
I'm nervous about sort of somehow arguing that sort of who can come out on a particular night as representative
Oh,
of the
no.
city.
And I'm not going to go there.
Yeah.
Because everybody who's here has a right to be here, whether they have small kids, big kids, gray hair, no hair. They're entitled to say their piece and to be heard.
Sure.
So I would like you, and I appreciate your willingness to do this, to make sure that in any presentation, it is noted at every step of the way that there is opposition to this plan.
Sure. Yeah, we can find a way to do that.
Thank you much.
Hi, my name is Justine Underhill. I won't talk too loud. First of all, I just wanted to thank you for being here and answering all these questions. It's not easy, and your work is clear, and you're far more articulate than I ever hoped to be. So, I am glad that we're reviewing T-zone codes. Before townhomes were effectively banned, and so I think it's good that we're approaching this. There is something that I did want to ask about. I'm jumping ahead a little bit because it's past my bedtime. I'm wondering about stormwater. I know that the Broadway has gone under extensive, I guess their roof, and maybe somebody can better speak to this, to better contain water. So with development on these T-zone sites, what are we allowed to require regarding stormwater? And can we require more than the Chesapeake Bay watershed standards? And does staff see that as needed?
Yeah, so the question is about sort of what can be required as part of stormwater water regulations. And that's, I will take it back and talk to the city's engineering staff about that. So generally, when the state sets a regulation, unless they specify some wiggle room, that is what you can require. But we'll take that back and talk to the engineering staff. I also know that they are trying to, they're delivering the Big Six. We're looking at greening Lincoln Avenue, sort of a whole suite of projects to try and do better with stormwater, that the city does flood. Storms are becoming more severe. And so I know Public Works is moving on that front, as well as council, to try and get a handle on flooding. But specific to this, we'll take a look. And I would think that certainly T-zones are maybe one place where you could talk about this, but it might be better to think about that in terms of the overall development regulations, because we are borrowing. So what are the overall requirements for development in the city, and whether we don't need a more holistic look at stormwater controls for development, regardless of where it happens.
And where can I find information? So would it be DPW that has that information, or?
Yeah, I can send you some contact information.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you.
Yep.
So
back.
Paul, yeah, welcome back.
We're on topic 2. If we can go back to the grouping, I think we're ready.
I was going to just deal with one issue at a time, as you had outlined, but I want to deal with two issues here, which is one, lot coverage.
Sure.
And the second, the approval process.
Mm-hmm.
So on the lot coverage front, first of all, thank you for page 18, because it's the first drawing in our area. And what I would like to ask, and maybe before you go to the council, if you could do that to scale and make sure it's accurate to scale, because that does not look accurate to scale.
Yep.
And that you also show what the maximum is, which is now, I guess under your proposal, 70%, what that would look like. We had a discussion the other day, and I would say one of the other people said, have you interfaced with the neighbors? And you've interfaced with me quite a lot, and I do appreciate it. But nobody's ever asked us what we want on the site. And we did give you a letter, and the council a letter last week to finally say, nobody's ever asked in a year and a half, but here's what would work for us. So we are at least on record with our opinion, and the concern from the site perspective. We've had one expert, which was Susan Bell, say that 50% coverage, which was what she recommended for this area. In the conversations in the Planning Commission, they came up with 60% with no study that I'm aware of, and no professional staff necessarily recommending that to them, but came up with 60%. That's what was presented to the League of Women Voters. That's what was presented to the Planning Commission when they were to vote the night of the 15th. And then input came from a developer. I will say a developer. You can argue this case with me, but I would like to know if that developer did indeed solicit letters from others, because they only addressed pretty much the points that developer raised. And are we looking at a broad view of development? Or are we looking at a developer and his business associates coming in, and then the Planning Commission reacted to that in a way they didn't react to 200 of us who have been in front of them multiple times and changed this and allowed 60 to 70%. But our concern is once we go beyond 50 to 60 to 70, then it becomes necessary. If you're going to use the space effectively, you almost have to have underground parking. And when you have to have underground parking, you're going to be pumping stormwater up. And as the lady alluded to, we've spent almost $300,000 at the Broadway to manage stormwater problems. And we will have a permanent water table increase if the area behind us is all underground parking. It's not just impermeable surface on the top. It's all the water that gets pumped out from sump pumps. We have sump pumps 24 hours a day, 2 of them in our building. If anybody digs in that area, they're going to hit water because there's a stream right there. So that's the one area. And I would ask if you, before you go back to the council, if you would present them with multiple pictures drawn to scale that show them what 60% looks like, 50%, and 70%. Because I think that this is telling, but this doesn't tell the whole story and doesn't necessarily tell it accurately. And then...
Oh, thank you.
That's a good boss.
Perfect leadership right there. Don't
doing a wonderful job. Thank you, Paul.
Don't tell facilities I spilled water. That's...
I agree, he is. And let me ask you about the special use permit, because I got to say I still don't understand. Sure. How many projects have we applied that to on this scale in the city of Falls Church?
So special use permit provisions do exist today. They're typically not used for things like this, although there are provisions for it. I think taller apartment buildings in the RM zones go through SUPs, although all of the RM land is largely at maximum density. There are various other approvals that roll to the BZA. So the SUP, like daycares in single-family zone districts, go through the SUP process. But you're right, they're not necessarily used for projects of this scale much anymore. If we can go to the approval process, though. I think some of this goes back to sort of a question that was raised earlier about sort of what does it take to make development feasible.
Right.
Some of this is just the carrying cost of the land, given that we are talking about development sort of parcels that are an acre or less. There's just not enough revenue on the other side to sort of carry a project through a 2-year approval process. And so the thought was to tighten up the box, make the project smaller, make it shorter, design some setbacks in from the beginning. And then presumably this could go through a shorter timeline of approval.
So I see 2 things. One, if there's problems with the special exception process, maybe we should be devoting some energy to improving that process so that it goes faster than it does. And maybe we should look at different scale of buildings should get different approaches, right? But a very large building in a T-zone, it doesn't seem to me, should get a much different process than a special exception process, because it affects streetscape, it affects parking, it affects tree canopy, it affects the residences around it. If it's 50 feet high, 10 feet away, it affects a lot of, and it fills up, 3/4 of an acre. It affects a lot of people. It could be 90 units, 80 units. These are big buildings, potentially. In fact, behind us, you made some comment, behind us is just as big a space as the Broadway is on. It's equal. It's about 1.6 acres. It's the same as the Broadway. And under this criteria, it could have much more impermeable surface and be a much bigger building than the Broadway. We have carve-outs for parking. We have carve-outs for a courtyard. This building wouldn't have to. So, I realize, some of these constraints deal with buildings that are going to be used for commercial versus residential, but I never saw, the total elimination of commercial. So I would just say, I would like to see some more thought given to when we use an SUP, when we use an a special exception, and I would say there are going to be circumstances in T-zones where we want to use a special exception process. In the case of the Broadway, I was looking at some literature somebody gave me the other day. The city got about $250,000, street improvements, traffic light improvements, other burial of electric cables, that really made us a much more inviting environment about it. It all happened through the special exception process. It won't happen through the SUP. So trying to write all these specific requirements in lieu of just streamlining the special exception process and determining to apply it to large structures, I don't think that's the route to go. I think we ought to define the special exception process, apply it here, and then for the special use permit, it's a novel approach. Try it on a few smaller properties before we launch to it as a solution for the whole T-zone, 3 acres, or 3% of the city, I should say. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, Paul.
Hello.
Hi, how are you? My name is Piroz Kanamalik. I first wanted to thank you very much. You guys did a great job. You have been working very hard on this, and I'm sorry that some people are not too nice to you. But I just wanted to mention about a couple of facts here. When Broadway was under construction, I was here. I owned the property. I was there. I was watching. They actually use my parking lot all the time to dump their, gravel or cements or whatnot. They cut more than 20 beautiful trees to build the Broadway there. They cut more than 20 beautiful trees to put the Broadway there. And then I have it here. I have the map. I pulled out the map and I count the trees. These are Broadway maps. Recently, and then a few years ago, they forced the neighbor across next to me to cut beautiful 60 feet grown trees, cut them down to the ground, because it was bothering their balconies. Number 3, they just recently caught 8 very expensive, beautiful 60 feet tall trees from their plaza area, okay? And they planted about maybe 2-3 feet trees instead of that. The reason I'm bringing this up, because there were a lot of talk about trees, and supposedly there are some beautiful trees next to them on my property, which is not true. I have just recently invited the arborists to come there to get the permit to trim some of the trees, because my other neighbors, my tenants, especially the ones who park there, complain that these trees are, when they get heavy, they can become very dangerous. They are falling off. Most of them are dry. I only have 2 trees next to Broadway that are breaking apart. They are halfway dry, dead. And then 2 wheat trees that they face the plaza, where they cut the 6 beautiful trees and whatnot. So the trees that I have are just very old, meaning that they are dry and they need to be trimmed. So I don't have any beautiful value tree that some people were talking about. Just for the record, I just wanted to clear that matter. Another fact I want to mention is that actually Broadway is putting a lot of shade on my property. Actually, I am the one who should go and complain here. Seriously. I mean, you can come and check it one day, I'll show it to you. I mean, in the afternoon sun, I don't have any sun. So anything I build there, it would be in the shade. It would be a total shade. Because of the tall building next to me, wouldn't let it happen. It happens during the summer, and I would have that problem. So I would be the one who actually have to complain about their sun not shining through my... The last item is that I've always mentioned that when they build that property, the architect who designed that property, they always knew, they always assumed, this is very typical, that the fact is that this is called the city of Falls Church. It's a city. It's an urbanized, dense city, 1 square mile. And we owe it to the future generation. We owe it, it's out of our control. It is absolutely wrong to say that developers want to become rich. That's why they, want to build and make money and whatnot. I don't think Tyson's Corner is becoming bigger. It's going to be bigger than Seattle because of developers are pushing to make money. No, it's just a planner. It's just a planning. It's a demand for it. Same as Arlington, same situation. Arlington didn't become Arlington because the developers were pushing and to make money or whatnot. It's the plans, it's the demand, it's the city planning, it's the requirement. It's owe it to the future generation, and we are enjoying it with the facilities now and whatnot, and we have to do the same thing. It's a city, and it's the 1 square mile, and it's a dense urbanized area, and definitely we run to a lot of things. I want to make one example from my very good neighbors, Broadway. The major problem that Broadway has is all those trash cans from the Kensington. I mean, I don't even know how they sleep because, I mean, 6 o'clock in the morning, the trucks come and bang, 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 it's all over the place. That's their problem. I am not the problem. The windows that were put there by the architect specially made sure, architect knew that at some point there would be a building maybe as tall as their building would come next to them. That's why they put such a small windows. Those are side windows. And if you go there, you can see most of them are covered with shades, furniture, or something like that. And some of them may be in the bathroom windows. So this is the way, because it's an urban area, it's a city area. When you design a building, you make sure that you put your side windows. They don't have any balcony facing my property. The only balconies that they face are very far away in the courtyard area. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Hi. So my name's Elizabeth Wilcox. I'm at 216 Great Falls Street, and I do have young children at home. I wanted to expand on the comment and focus around housing that this gentleman had commented earlier. And if we can bring up slide 11, I think the comment specifically was around housing and the percentage of property that the T-zones occupy within the city. I think there was the comment, it's around 3 to 4% of the parcels that are within the city. And I wanted to just also highlight a little bit further. So based off of the Planning Commission recommendations and the staff recommendations, there's, I guess, both groups are recommending no residential properties on North Washington, north of Great Falls. So if we actually take off that section, it's even limiting, I guess, the residential area to 1.5 to 2% of the parcels in question. And I guess, so one thing I like to do in my spare time, I like to browse real estate in the Falls Church City. I like to see what are housing prices looking like. And I guess one question, I don't know, for you, or just in general, are you aware that developers have listed home sites on that T1 zone south of Great Falls on that North Washington? It kind of aligns with that limited housing unit size. So these were 3-story townhomes. They are 2 bedrooms, about 2,000, between 2,000 to 2,300 square feet. They were listed for $800,000. They were listed there, at least I saw them the last week or so, and ironically, they were not listed today. So just curious if that target aligns with what your concept of affordable housing is. And then also along affordable housing, I know in previous meetings you had commented about kind of the longevity or what are the requirements for keeping that affordable housing as a requirement for these units. Is that 5 years? Is that 10 years? I didn't see that listed here on the slides, but was wondering if you could comment on that. And then also just wanted to kind of add my support for some of the previous comments around the stormwater runoff. If there has been research beyond the 10-year storm, as well as around research around the tree canopies, and particularly around the flood areas in TZone parcels on Park.
Yeah, so there are, so sort of going back to the why, right, there are sort of multiple goals that are trying to be achieved here, right? There's housing supply, there's housing affordability, there's reinvestment in the T-zones. And so, you know, each parcel probably isn't going to solve all three of those problems. So there are different pieces in this proposal that are going to address sort of different things. The $800,000 for townhouses lines up with what we had heard from the assessor. And I think that's why when you look at the affordability requirements, the market might be able to solve the supply problem, but the market's not going to solve the affordability problem. And that's why staff is recommending that commitment to affordable units inside the project or the cash in lieu option. Recently in projects, the control period for those units has been for the life of the project. I know the early units that were negotiated, it was a 20-year control period, and in more recent approvals, we've been able to secure life of the project commitments.
Okay. And then I guess I don't remember what your answer was as far as have you done research on the stormwater beyond the 10 years?
So that's something we have to look into about whether it's allowable under state code, and then to talk to the stormwater engineering team about sort of what are the expectations going forward.
Okay. And then the other lady had a comment around kind of like the flood zone areas around Park and Lee that are common around that area of the city.
Yep.
Have you guys done research on that?
So it gets looked at with each project. For example, when the dual trails were going in, that stormwater channel was a big deal because there was a lot of land disturbance associated with the dual trails, and that was something we worked with. Actually, we sort of held Nova Parks to the fire on how are you going to sort of mitigate or avoid any sort of stormwater impacts downstream, because we know this is a crowded channel, right? That there's so much water in the pipe that no more can get in, and that's what leads to that sort of pocket flooding or upstream flooding. So that is something the engineering staff is looking at. It's something that the Public Utilities Commission is looking at. That's what motivated the big six of let's take care of the six biggest problems we can, and then let's not stop there. Let's keep going. So it's an ongoing effort, and I think it's important enough that we reconstituted a board and commission to try and speed it up.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, back. Sorry, again, I'll be brief, and it's a really good jumping off point. Her comments, I found this cool map on the website, which I think does a better job of putting in context the T-zone map, the major map that actually has the acreages for the parcels. And to her point, I mean, you're talking about 24 acres. But the fact of the matter is when the Planning Commission wrote off North Washington north of Great Falls with the stroke of a pen, that was 10 acres gone. So to me, this ceased to be a housing plan. And like so much of the literature at the beginning of this presentation is about why we need different and diverse housing and so forth. It ceased to be a housing plan when we wrote that off. I think that's a significant mistake. And just going at it from a different direction, what is the compelling commercial need other than just complying with the small area plan developed back in 2014? What is the compelling need for this community for additional commercial space? I just saw that unfortunately, the small form target is out. We've got some other challenges keeping commercial, and why the additional commercial when we obviously do need housing. So that's
sure.
it.
Yeah. So the pendulum swings. So when Ballston was developing years ago, they actually had to require residential development because the commercial lease rates were so high that if you didn't require residential, no one would build it. And now the pendulum has swung back that now residential is so valuable that if you don't require commercial, no one's going to build it. And so the idea is to try and sort of steer through the middle of that instead of allowing development to swing back and forth, to try and chart a course through the middle and avoid having the city develop a sort of a monoculture. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Hi, I'm Debbie Doctor. I live at the Broadway. First, I'd like to address a couple comments that were made about the trees. The ones behind us were cut because we were told they were diseased. The ones in the courtyard were cut because they were starting to encroach on our parking garage, and that's why we had to take the big trees out and put in new ones. First of all, I would like to know of the big high-rises that are going up now, the one on Washington Street, Founders Row, the one across from it, and is the one next to the Giant also in Falls Church?
The West Falls development? Yes.
Okay. How many housing units are they combined?
I just had this number in my budget narrative. Okay, so we've got about 700 at West Falls, and then Founders Row is 370. Let's see, Broad and Washington is 270. So I think all told, it's somewhere in the neighborhood between like low end is 1,500, high end is 2,000.
And what portion of those, unit numbers, are we talking affordable housing?
So each of them are committing different percentages. I think Founders Row, one is 6%. I think what you're trying to get to is total numbers. So let me sort of work through the math here, but we've got sort of 6, 10, 12, 6. So I don't know, let's say that averages out to 8. So about 8%. So take 10% and then lop a few off.
Okay.
So you're at what, 2,200, and then you lop off a few, so you're somewhere in like the 150 range?
Right, so we're still going to need...
A lot of napkin math on the fly.
Right, and we're still going to need more because, as you said, the city's growing.
Yep.
Okay, so of Founders Row, which we've kind of acknowledged, but they really don't have a tree canopy. And from what I can see at Washington and Broad, they're built right up to the street on both sides. I don't see a tree canopy because where the building is, there just can't be a tree canopy there. I mean, it's right up to the road on both sides.
So the building actually got pulled back on the Washington facade. So on the Broad facade, the tree canopy may not grow to be as lush, right? It was sort of overarching over the Applebee's and the medical building. So there may be, the trees there probably won't be as grand as they used to be. If you remember the old Robertson building, that thing was maybe 10 feet, maybe 12 feet off the curb line. So it was just sort of sidewalk, curb, and a planter with no tree in it. And so they've actually pulled the building back, which will get us a proper streetscape.
But they're going to have the large trees?
They'll plant the canopy trees, and then I think the hope is they grow as tall as they can.
Okay. So then my next comment is about Park Avenue, because, of course, I live at the Broadway. You have a great street plan, which really starts around the library up in that area. I will tell you that when you have parades or when the prom groups come down the street, that our street, down where we are, even past where we are, is loaded with people watching the parades because that's the street that people go to because they don't want to be on Broad. Most people walk on that street, they bike on that street, and as several people have pointed out, we need a tree canopy there. So to me, it doesn't make sense to put another high-rise there when we're trying to have that community feel. Do it on Broad, do it on Washington. You've got plenty of other places to do it. The second thing I want to say is you already know that there's a stream that runs under the Broadway. We're using 2 sump pumps now. The T-zone behind us has that same stream. So we've already got stormwater problems. And we also have it because at Lee and Broad Street is one of the lowest parts of Broad Street. It's like a deep V there. So we have huge stormwater problems every time there's a big, fast rain. So to allow another huge building on that T1 zone is going to create more stormwater problems. So I don't understand why you would, if you're going to make Park Avenue a great street, let's make it a great street with big canopy trees and buildings that people can sit in front of and enjoy the parades and all the things that we like going on there, that go on there now. So I would just hope that when you consider what you're going to build there, that you remember all those good, positive things we use that road for, and not just put another Founders Row there. It just doesn't make sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
These are going to be 2 quick questions. One is one answer. What is the one mirror that in the city's history? What's that building? Which building was that?
I think it's actually the townhouses on the not the commercial townhouses, but the residential townhouses. Sort of in between the back of the Spectrum and the library.
Okay.
Go to the example.
Yeah, the Madison?
Yeah.
Okay, and why was that, by the way? Why was that the only one that was ever used? Why did you all discontinue, just so I understand?
Well, we didn't discontinue it. No one can build under it. So that actually goes back I think this is now a 10-plus-year-old commission. It was the Zoning Ordinance Advisory Committee. It was a sort of a creature of the city appointed by council, residents from throughout the city looking at ways to improve the zoning ordinance. And actually, it was their recommendation to scrap the MER, that there were too many design requirements within the MER to allow for a feasible building, right? When someone goes to build a building, it costs money to buy the land, it costs money to pay your architect, it costs money to buy construction materials, to pay people to put them together. And then at the end of the day, you get a revenue return. And if the revenue return doesn't cover all those other costs, then no one builds. And the MER was in that situation where all of the design requirements that went into the project meant it cost so much to build, and there wasn't enough revenue to cover the costs.
Okay.
And so people haven't developed under
Just
the MER.
wanted that, well, that was,
Yep.
and the other one is going to be a pretty easy question because there should be, history to this one. I spent my whole career, 45, 50 years, basically working on regulations and legislation. So I'm going to ask you the question in my mind. Once the city council decides, makes its decision, votes, approves, wild guess, closely along the lines of your column, what would be the effective date? Is it 90 days out? Is it 6 months out? Is it tomorrow? What's the effective date typically for these types of rezoning changes?
Let's see. So the last zoning code amendment I can remember doing was the SE code change, and we made that effective immediately. That was a change to move from sort of net commercial square footage to to new significant commercial. Wording switch, that was effective immediately. The split lots, which was several years ago, that set an effective date into the future to allow people to put their accounts in order. We could look at that about whether it would make sense to set an effective date, whether it's 3 months.
So you all have not thought about the effective date?
No, we haven't thought about that. It has been done, but we haven't thought about it here.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I told you there were two straightforward questions. Thanks.
No, I'm going to give you a last and final.
All right. Whew. I was worried we were running out.
So thank you again for staying, and everyone said you are an excellent speaker and you give factual answers. So my career was I was an engineer, worked for the Navy for years, mostly on life support equipment. And when things were designed wrong, we started creating a list of the don't do this again. And so I'm curious, and you don't have to give an answer, if you look around Falls Church and the things that you've done in planning for in the last 20 years, do you maintain a list of, God, we're not going to do that again? And you don't have to tell me what they are. I just want to know, have you got that sort of memory somewhere in your corporate ledger?
Yeah, so I usually, this is going to be kind of boring. Some of it is as detailed as, we put the wrong brick pattern in, that we didn't put a soldier course against the concrete ramp, or we didn't put the bike racks in the right place, or that bench is the wrong color, or it's turned the wrong way. So some of it is in the minutia of, how the site lays out. But a lot of it is also sort of lesson learned, right? And I don't know, everybody does this. I think planners do it too. But when we walk around Falls Church and when we walk around other places, we look at buildings and we say, well, that's a pretty good transition. I think what planners then do is they go back into their office and they look up the development approvals and they figure out how tall the thing was, how far apart it was, so we can say, gosh, there's a great example. That building's 60 feet, that one's 40 feet, and they're 25 feet apart. So we actually go back and pull those numbers, and so we learn examples from other places, or we look and we say, yeah, I can't believe someone permitted that. And we think about, well, how does that break down into the actual mechanics? So usually when you see people do sort of urban design surveys, the format typically is to sort of show pictures. What do people like? What do they not like? And then to break out the actual measurements underneath that. And that's what you'll see show up in the development regulations.
Well, it's interesting you say that. Everyone hates the back of the spectrum. I think that's a universal feeling around town. From what we understand from someone who lived at the Broadway, who was in the real estate business and watched the spectrum go up, from what we're told, so I hope you do have your file, that was something that the whole plan was approved for the spectrum, and then the developer came in and said, we really need to put this on the back of the building. And apparently they'd even done the first shovel of dirt. And then the city council said, okay, we'll approve that. So I hope somewhere in your file, since I think there's a universal agreement, that was supposed to be green open space or something, because it makes no sense whatsoever. I hope in your files that everyone remember, look up in your files, apparently that's how the spectrum back townhouses came to be. So I hope that you have one of those.
All right. Any others?
Thank you.
All right, and did we ever get anyone online for the question? Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. It's been a due. And like we said, stay tuned. Next date should be a council work session, April 24th. These slides will be up. I know Jack promised tomorrow. We'll either do it tomorrow or the day after. Depends on how quick we can turn around a website update. But look forward to it going forward more. Thank you.
Come by.
Yeah.
The Today column.